A venomous letter shatters Elinor Carlisle's world, accusing someone of stealing her wealthy aunt's fortune. Is it Mary Gerrard, the captivating lodgekeeper's daughter, who's bewitched Elinor's fiancé, Roddy? As jealousy festers and secrets unravel at the grand Hunterbury estate, a sudden death sparks whispers of poison. Was it natural, or murder? When Mary collapses after a fatal cup of tea, all fingers point to Elinor. Can Hercule Poirot untangle a web of lies, hidden biliage, and deadly greed before the gallows claim her? Dive into sad Cypress, where love, betrayal, and a shocking courtroom drama collide. Chapter 1. The poison pen. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, its edges crumpled as if it had been clutched too tightly by nervous hands. Elinor Carlisle stood by the window of her modest London flat, the morning light filtering through the lace curtains, casting delicate shadows across the cream-colored envelope in her hand. The address was scrawled in black ink, jagged and uneven as though the writer had been in a hurry or afraid. Her name, Miss Elinor Carlisle, stared back at her, the letters sharp and accusing. She turned the envelope over, noting the absence of a return address, and her heart gave a small, uneasy thud. Anonymous letters were never bearers of good news. She slit the envelope with a silver letter opener, a gift from her late mother, and unfolded the single sheet inside. The words were written in the same frantic hand, each sentence a dart aimed at her composure. You think you're safe, don't you? But someone's worming their way into her heart. She's changing her will, and you'll be left with nothing. Watch the lodgekeeper's daughter. She's not what she seems. Elinor's breath caught. Her fingers tightened on the paper, crinkling it further. Aunt Laura, Mrs. Laura Wellman, her mother's sister, the matriarch of Hunterbury, was the only family she had left. The sprawling estate in Maidensford, with its ivy-clad walls and rolling lawns, was more than a home. It was a legacy, a promise of security for Elinor and her cousin Roddy, to whom she had been engaged for scarcely a month. The thought of someone scheming to steal that legacy sent a chill through her. She read the letter again, the words lodgekeeper, daughter burning into her mind. Mary Gerrard, the name conjured a vague image, a girl with golden hair and a quiet smile. The daughter of the estate's lodgekeeper who had grown up on the fringes of Hunterbury's grandeur. Elinor had seen her only a handful of times, always at a distance, Mary fetching water from the well or tending the roses by the lodge. Why would anyone suggest Mary was a threat? And why now, when Aunt Laura's health was faltering, her strength sapped by a recent stroke? Elinor folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket, her mind racing. She glanced at the clock on the mantelpiece, 9:30. Roddy would be here soon, his cheerful grin and easy charm a balm to her nerves. But even as she thought of him, a flicker of doubt stirred. Roddy was her cousin, her confidant, her love, but he was also impulsive, easily swayed by beauty or novelty. Could he be trusted with something as insidious as this letter suggested? The doorbell chimed, sharp and clear, pulling her from her thoughts. She smoothed her dress, a simple navy frock that flattered her dark hair and pale skin, and opened the door. Roddy Wellman stood there, his auburn hair slightly mussed, his blue eyes sparkling with their usual mischief. He wore a tweed suit, the jacket slung over one shoulder, and carried the air of a man who knew the world was his to charm. Elinor, my darling, he said, stepping inside and kissing her cheek. You look positively somber. What's the matter? Has the cat eaten your breakfast again? She forced a smile, the letter burning a hole in her pocket. Nothing so dramatic, she said, her voice lighter than she felt. Just a bit of news from Hunterbury. Aunt Laura's not well, you know. Roddy's expression softened, though his eyes flicked away, as they often did when the conversation turned serious. Poor old thing. We ought to go down and see her, don't you think? Cheer her up with some London gossip. Elinor nodded, her resolve hardening. Yes, we should. Tomorrow, perhaps. I'll telephone Mrs. Bishop to arrange it. Mrs. Bishop, the housekeeper at Hunterbury, was a formidable woman whose loyalty to Aunt Laura was matched only by her disapproval of anything modern or frivolous like Roddy. Splendid, Roddy said, tossing his jacket onto the sofa. Now, how about some tea? I'm parched. As Elinor moved to the kitchen, the letter's words echoed in her mind. Watch the lodgekeeper's daughter. She resolved to keep the letter a secret, at least for now. Roddy's heart was too easily swayed, and she couldn't bear the thought of him dismissing her fears, or worse, being drawn into whatever web this letter hinted at. The train to Maidensford was a quiet affair, the countryside slipping past in a blur of green fields and stone walls. Elinor sat by the window, her hands folded in her lap, the letter now hidden in her suitcase. Roddy sprawled across from her, read a newspaper, occasionally chuckling at some society column. His nonchalance grated on her, though she couldn't say why. Perhaps it was the way he seemed untouched by the weight of the letter, oblivious to the storm brewing in her heart. Hunterbury loomed into view as the train slowed, its chimneys rising above the trees like sentinels. The estate was a vision of timeless elegance, red bricks softened by ivy, windows glinting in the afternoon sun, and a gravel drive that crunched satisfyingly underfoot. As they stepped from the car, a hired taxi from the station, Lina felt a pang of nostalgia. This was where she'd spent childhood summers, chasing Roddy through the orchards, listening to Aunt Laura's stories by the fire. But now, the air felt different, heavy with unspoken tensions. Mrs. Bishop greeted them at the door, her grey hair pulled into a severe bun, her black dress starched to perfection. "Miss Elinor, Mr. Roddy," she said, her voice clipped. "Mrs. Wellman is in the drawing room. She's been asking for you." They followed her through the grand hall, past portraits of stern-faced Wellmans glaring down from gilded frames. The drawing room was warm, the fire crackling despite the summer heat. Aunt Laura sat in a high-backed chair, a shawl draped over her shoulders, her face pale but her eyes sharp. At 68 she was still a commanding presence, though her hands trembled slightly as she reached for Elinor's. "My dear girl," Laura said, her voice soft but firm. "You've come at last. And Roddy always the charmer." Roddy grinned, kissing her hand. "Aunt Laura, you're looking well. The country air suits you." She chuckled, but it turned into a cough, and Elinor noticed the nurse hovering nearby, a stout woman in a crisp white uniform, her face unreadable. "This is Nurse Hopkins," Laura said, gesturing. "She's been a godsend since my episode." Nurse Hopkins nodded curtly, her eyes flicking over Elinor and Roddy with a scrutiny that felt almost invasive. Elinor forced a polite smile, her mind flashing to the letter. Watch the lodgekeeper's daughter. Was Nurse Hopkins part of this? Or was she merely a bystander in whatever game was afoot? As they settled into conversation, the door opened, and a young woman entered with a tray of tea. Elinor's breath caught. Mary Gerrard was no longer the gangly girl of her childhood memories. She was tall, her golden hair pinned loosely, her blue eyes bright with a quiet confidence. Her simple dress did little to hide her grace, and when she smiled, the room seemed to brighten. "Mary dear," Laura said, her voice warm. "Come, sit with us." Mary hesitated, then perched on the edge of a chair, her hands folded in her lap. Roddy's eyes followed her every move, and Elinor felt a stab of something sharp, jealousy perhaps, or fear. Mary's presence was magnetic, her beauty effortless, and Roddy was already leaning forward, his charm dialed to its fullest. "Mary's been telling me about her dreams," Laura said, her eyes twinkling. "She wants to study nursing, perhaps even abroad. I think it's a splendid idea." Elinor's heart sank. Abroad? That would require money from Aunt Laura's estate, perhaps. The letter's warning rang louder now, a bell tolling in her mind. She glanced at Roddy, who was laughing at something Mary said, his eyes alight with admiration. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in. That evening, after dinner, Elinor wandered the grounds alone. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. The cypress tree by the lodge, a towering, mournful figure, cast a long shadow across the lawn. She paused, her hand brushing the rough bark, and thought of the letter. "She's not what she seems." What did it mean? Was Mary a schemer, or was someone else pulling the strings? Footsteps crunched behind her, and she turned to see Mary approaching, a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. "Miss Carlisle," Mary said, her voice soft. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Elinor lied, her smile tight. "It's a lovely evening." Mary nodded, her gaze drifting to the cypress. "This place. It's always felt like home, but also like a dream I don't quite belong to. Mrs. Wellman's been so kind to me." Elinor's throat tightened. "She's fond of you," she said, the words tasting bitter. "She speaks of you often." Mary's eyes met hers, and for a moment, Elinor thought she saw a flicker of something guilt-fear, but then Mary smiled and it was gone. "She's like a mother to me," Mary said. "I'd do anything for her." The words were innocent, but they landed like a blow. Elinor excused herself, her heart pounding as she hurried back to the house. In the hallway, she nearly collided with Nurse Hopkins, who was carrying a tray of medical supplies. The nurse's eyes narrowed, and Elinor felt a chill, as if she'd been caught doing something wrong. "Careful, Miss Carlisle," Nurse Hopkins said, her voice low. "You don't want to stir up trouble." Elinor nodded, her mind racing. She climbed the stairs to her room, the letters weighed heavy in her pocket. As she closed the door, she heard voices drifting from Aunt Laura's room, Laura's soft murmur and Mary's gentle reply. The words were indistinct, but one phrase stood out, sharp and clear: "the will." Chapter 2. Shadows of Doubt. The train to Maidensford rattled along, its rhythm a steady counterpoint to Elinor Carlisle's racing thoughts. She sat by the window, her gloved hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes fixed on the blur of green fields and hedgerows that slipped past. Roddy Wellman, her fiancé, lounged across from her, his long legs stretched out, his face half hidden behind a newspaper. The carriage was quiet save for the occasional rustle of pages and the soft clink of teacups from the dining car. Elinor's mind, however, was anything but quiet. The anonymous letter, its words sharp as a blade, lingered in her memory. "Someone is scheming to steal your aunt's fortune. Watch Mary Gerrard." She glanced at Roddy, his dark hair falling boyishly over his forehead. His lips curved in that half-smile she had once found so charming. Now, it irritated her. A reminder of how easily his attention wandered. They had been engaged for 3 months, And yet, since that letter arrived, Elinor felt a growing distance between them. She wondered if he sensed it too, or if he was simply oblivious, lost in his own world of charm and whimsy. "Roddy," she said, her voice low but firm, "do you think Aunt Laura is all right?" He lowered the newspaper, his blue eyes meeting hers with a flicker of surprise. "Aunt Laura? Why, she's tough as old boots, Elinor. That stroke last year didn't keep her down for long. What's got you so worried?" She hesitated, her fingers tightening around the edge of her handbag. She hadn't shown him the letter. It felt too raw, too accusatory, and she wasn't sure she trusted his reaction. Roddy was charming, yes, but he was also fickle, prone to flights of fancy. If she told him about the letter's insinuations, would he laugh it off or take it seriously? Worse, would he look at Mary Gerrard differently? "It's just the letter," she said finally, choosing her words carefully. "It mentioned Aunt Laura's health, and other things. I can't shake the feeling that something's wrong at Hunterbury." Roddy folded the newspaper and leaned forward, his expression softening. "Elinor, you're letting that poison pen nonsense get to you. It's probably just some spiteful village gossip jealous of Aunt Laura's money. You know how people talk." She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Perhaps you're right," she murmured, though she didn't believe it. The letter had been specific, its tone viciously precise. It wasn't just gossip, felt personal, as if the writer knew exactly how to pierce her insecurities. The train slowed, and the platform at Maidensford came into view. A small station surrounded by rolling hills and the faint outline of Hunterbury's chimneys in the distance. Elinor's heart tightened. She loved the estate, its sprawling gardens, its oak-paneled halls, the cypress tree that stood sentinel by the lake. It was her childhood refuge, where she and Roddy had played as cousins under Aunt Laura's indulgent gaze. But now, it felt different, tainted by the letter's venom. They disembarked, and a hired car took them to Hunterbury. The estate loomed ahead, its stone facade grand but weathered, like an aging dowager refusing to bow to time. Mrs. Bishop, the housekeeper, greeted them at the door, her face as stern as ever, her black dress crisp and unyielding. "Miss Elinor, Mr. Roddy," she said, her voice clipped. "Mrs. Wilman is resting, but she's been asking for you." "How is she, Mrs. Bishop?" Elinor asked, removing her hat and smoothing her dark hair. The housekeeper's lips pursed. "Not well, I'm afraid. The second stroke has taken its toll. Nurse Hopkins and Nurse O'Brien are with her now." But she trailed off, her eyes flickering with something Elinor couldn't quite read: disapproval, perhaps, or worry. Roddy, oblivious to the undercurrent, clapped his hands together. "Well, let's see her then. Can't keep Aunt Laura waiting." They followed Mrs. Bishop upstairs, the familiar creak of the staircase underfoot. The house smelled of polished wood and lavender, but there was a new scent, too, something medicinal, sharp, and antiseptic. Elinor's stomach churned as they reached Aunt Laura's bedroom. The heavy curtains were half drawn, casting the room in a muted, amber glow. Aunt Laura lay in the four-poster bed, her once vibrant face pale and sunken, her hands frail against the embroidered coverlet. "Elinor, my dear," she said, her voice a fragile thread. "And Roddy, you've come." Elinor knelt beside the bed, taking her aunt's hand. It was cold, the skin thin as paper. "Of course we came, Aunt Laura. We've been worried about you." Laura's eyes, still sharp despite her frailty, studied Elinor's face. "You're a good girl, Elinor, always have been, but you worry too much." She turned her gaze to Roddy, who stood at the foot of the bed, shifting his weight awkwardly. "And you, Radisteel, chasing dreams, I suppose." Roddy grinned, though it was strained. "Always, Aunt Laura. But I'm here now, aren't I?" The moment was interrupted by the arrival of Nurse Hopkins, a stout woman with a brisk manner, and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. She carried a tray with a glass of water and a small vial of pills. "Time for Mrs. Wellman's medicine," she said, her tone professional but edged with authority. Behind her, Nurse O'Brien, younger and more nervous, hovered in the doorway, her red hair tucked under a starched cap. Elinor watched as Nurse Hopkins administered the pills, her movements precise. There was something about the nurse that unsettled her guardedness, a hint of calculation in her quick glances. Or perhaps it was just Elinor's imagination, fueled by the letter's accusations. Dinner that evening was a tense affair. The dining room, with its long mahogany table and crystal chandelier, felt too large for the three of them: Lana, Roddy, and Mary Gerrard, who had been invited at Aunt Laura's insistence. Mary sat across from Elinor, her auburn hair catching the candlelight, her smile shy but warm. She was beautiful, Elinor admitted to herself, with a natural grace that made her seem out of place in the grandeur of Hunterbury. Roddy, predictably, was entranced. He leaned toward Mary, his voice animated as he asked about her studies, her plans to attend a nursing school abroad. "You've got ambition, Mary," he said, his eyes bright. "Not many girls from Maidensford would dream of leaving the village, let alone studying in Paris or Vienna." Mary blushed, her fingers tracing the edge of her wineglass. "It's only a dream, Mr. Wellman. I'd need a scholarship or, well, some kind of help." Elinor's fork paused mid-air. She caught the glance Mary sent toward the head of the table, where Aunt Laura's empty chair stood. Was Mary hinting at something? The letter's words echoed in her mind. Someone is scheming to steal your aunt's fortune. Mary's a clever girl, Elinor said, her voice cool. I'm sure she'll find a way. Roddy shot her a look, his brow furrowing. No need to be so formal, Elinor. Mary's practically family, isn't she? Aunt Laura's always been fond of her. The words stung, though Elinor kept her expression neutral. Practically family. She sipped her wine, the bitterness lingering on her tongue. After dinner, as Mary excused herself to visit her father at the lodge, Roddy followed her to the door, his laughter echoing down the hall. Elinor stood alone in the dining room, her hands clenched at her sides, the chandelier's light casting jagged shadows on the walls. Later that night, unable to sleep, Elinor wandered the house. The corridors were silent, save for the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. She found herself outside Aunt Laura's room, the door slightly ajar. A soft glow spilled into the hallway, and she heard the low murmur of voices Nurse Hopkins and Nurse O'Brien, speaking in hushed tones. She's not long for this world, Nurse Hopkins was saying. And then what? The will's not been changed, but you know how she dotes on that girl. Nurse O'Brien's voice was softer, tinged with unease. It's not right, is it? All that money, and her so young. Elinor's breath caught. She pressed herself against the wall, her heart pounding. Were they talking about Mary? She strained to hear more, but the nurse's voices dropped to a whisper, and then the light went out. She waited, her pulse racing, until the hallway was silent again. She slipped into Aunt Laura's room, her eyes adjusting to the dimness. The air was heavy with the scent of lavender and medicine. On the bedside table, a stack of papers caught her eye, letters half-written in Aunt Laura's trembling hand. Elinor hesitated, then picked one up. The words were faint, smudged, but clear enough to send a chill through her. To marry Gerrard for a future. Everything I can give. Elinor's hand shook as she set the letter down. Everything. The word burned in her mind, a confirmation of her worst fears. Mary Gerrard, the lodgekeeper's daughter, was poised to take what should have been hers and Roddy's. The fortune, the estate, the legacy. It was slipping away, and with it, the future with Roddy. She left the room, her footsteps silent on the carpet, but her thoughts were a storm. The letter, the nurse's whispers, Roddy's infatuation had all pointed to one thing. Mary Gerrard was a threat, and Elinor, for the first time in her life, felt a flicker of something dark and dangerous within her, a spark that could ignite into something far worse than jealousy. The night deepened, and Hunterbury seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for the shadows of doubt to solidify into something far more deadly. The days that followed were a blur of strained smiles and polite conversations, each one laced with an undercurrent of tension. Aunt Laura's condition worsened, her moments of lucidity growing rarer. Nurse Hopkins and Nurse O'Brien were ever present, their professional efficiency a stark contrast to the chaos of Elinor's emotions. Roddy, meanwhile, seemed to drift further away, his attention fixed on Mary whenever she appeared. He offered to drive her to the village, lingered in the garden to talk with her, and once Elinor caught him staring at Mary as she walked by the lake, her silhouette framed against the cypress tree. Elinor tried to focus on Aunt Laura, sitting by her bedside for hours, reading aloud from her favorite novels or simply holding her hand, but her mind wandered, circling back to the letter, to Mary, to the future that felt increasingly uncertain. She began to notice small things: Nurse Hopkins's quick glances at the medicine cabinet, Nurse O'Brien's nervous habit of twisting her apron, the way Mrs. Bishop's eyes followed Mary with a mix of pity and resentment. The household was a web of secrets, and Elinor felt trapped at its center. One afternoon, as she walked through the garden, she saw Mary sitting on a bench, sketching the cypress tree. The girl's pencil moved with a quiet confidence, her face serene. Elinor paused, watching from a distance, her heart a tangle of conflicting emotions. Mary was beautiful, yes, but there was something else, a kindness, a simplicity that made her seem untouchable. It was no wonder Roddy was drawn to her, and yet that same quality made Elinor's resentment burn hotter. "Miss Carlisle," Mary said, looking up with a smile. "I didn't see you there. Would you like to join me?" Elinor hesitated, then sat beside her, the bench cold against her legs. "You draw well," she said, her voice stiff. "Thank you," Mary replied, her cheeks flushing. "It's just a hobby, but it helps me think. I've always loved this tree. It's so sad, don't you think? Like it's mourning something." Elinor glanced at the cypress, its branches drooping like a widow's veil. "Sad cypress," she murmured, the name feeling oddly fitting. "It's been here longer than any of us. It's seen things we'll never know." Mary nodded, her eyes distant. "Mrs. Wellman told me once that it was planted when she was a girl. She said it reminded her of lost love." The words hit Elinor like a blow. Lost love. Was that why Aunt Laura was so fond of Mary? Did she see something of herself in the girl? Or was it more than that, some secret tied to the estate, to the will, to the letter Elinor had found? They sat in silence for a moment, the air heavy with unspoken questions. Then Mary spoke again, her voice soft. "Miss Carlisle, I hope you don't think that I'm trying to take anything from you. Mrs. Wellman's been so kind, but I'd never ask for more than I deserve." Elinor's throat tightened. Was Mary being genuine, or was this a calculated move to disarm her? The letter's warning, I echoed in her mind, but she forced a smile. Of course not. Mary, Aunt Laura's generosity is her own to give. Mary seemed to relax, but Elinor's unease only grew. She stood, brushing imaginary dust from her skirt. I should check on Aunt Laura, she said, and walked away, her heart pounding with a mix of guilt and suspicion. That evening, Roddy cornered her in the library, his face serious for once. Elinor, we need to talk, he said, closing the door behind him. The room was dim, lit only by a single lamp, and the shelves of leather-bound books seemed to loom over them. What is it? She asked, though she dreaded the answer. He ran a hand through his hair, a nervous gesture she knew too well. It's about Mary. I can't help it, Elinor. She's different. She's not like who's not caught up in all this. He gestured vaguely at the room, the house, their lives. I think I'm falling for her. The words were a knife, sharp and precise. Elinor stared at him, her breath shallow. She had known this was coming, had seen it in his eyes, his smiles, his lingering glances, but hearing it aloud was something else entirely. And what about us? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Roddy looked away, his jaw tight. I don't know, Elinor. I thought I loved you, but it's not the same, not anymore. She wanted to scream, to shake him, to demand he take it back, but she didn't. She stood there, her hands trembling, her heart breaking, and said nothing. Roddy left the room, and she sank into a chair, the weight of his words crushing her. The next morning, Aunt Laura had another episode of seizure. Nurse Hopkins called it, though her face was grim as she adjusted the pillows. Elinor stood by the bed, helpless, as Nurse O'Brien whispered prayers under her breath. Roddy was nowhere to be seen, likely with Mary, Elinor thought bitterly. When Aunt Laura stabilized, Elinor retreated to the study, needing solitude. There, on the desk, she found another letter, this one unfinished, in Aunt Laura's handwriting. It was addressed to her solicitor, and the words were clear. Revise my will. Ensure Mary Gerrard is provided for. Elinor's vision blurred, with tears not of sadness, but of rage. She crumpled the letter in her fist, her mind racing. Mary Gerrard, with her innocent smiles and her dreams of Paris, was taking everything Ratty the fortune. The future Elinor had always assumed was hers. She stood, her breath ragged, and moved to the window, staring out at the cypress tree. Its branches swayed in the wind, a silent witness to her unraveling. She didn't hear Nurse Hopkins enter until the woman spoke. Miss Carlisle, you look pale. Is something wrong? Elinor turned, forcing a smile. Just tired, nurse. It's been a long few days. Nurse Hopkins's eyes narrowed, but she nodded. You should rest. This house, it takes its toll. As the nurse left, Elinor's gaze fell on the medicine cabinet in the corner, its glass doors glinting in the morning light. Inside, vials and syringes gleamed, their contents a mystery to her untrained eye. But one word stood out on the label: morphine. Her breath caught, and for a moment she imagined its power to silence her pain, to reclaim what was slipping away. She shook her head, horrified by the thought. But it lingered, a shadow in her mind, growing darker with each passing hour. Hunterbury was no longer a refuge. It was a battlefield, and Elinor was losing ground. The chapter drew to a close with Elinor standing alone in the study, the crumpled letter still in her hand, the weight of her choices pressing down on her. Outside, the cypress tree stood silent, its mournful branches a mirror to her soul, as the shadows of doubt deepened into something far more dangerous. Chapter 3. The silent passing. The dawn broke over Hunterbury with a deceptive calm, the kind that cloaks secrets in soft light. The estate, nestled in the rolling hills of Maidensford, stood as a monument to time, its ivy-clad walls whispering of generations past. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of polished wood and the faint tink of medicinal tonics. Elinor Carlisle moved through the grand hall, her footsteps muffled on the Persian rugs, her mind a storm of grief and suspicion. Aunt Laura Wellman, the matriarch who had raised her, lay dead in the night, her life extinguished like a candle snuffed out by an unseen hand. The official word was natural causes, a second stroke. The doctors said, but the whispers among the staff told a different story, one that gnawed at Elinor's already fraying nerves. She paused by the tall windows overlooking the garden where Horlick the gardener was pruning roses with a methodical precision that seemed at odds with the chaos inside. His weathered hands moved with care, snipping away dead blooms, as if he could trim away the estate's troubles. Elinor envied his focus. Her own thoughts were a tangled knot, pulling tighter with every memory of Aunt Laura's final days. The old woman's frailty had been stark, her once sharp eyes clouded with pain. Yet there had been moments of clarity, moments when she'd spoken of Mary Gerrard, the lodgekeeper's daughter, with a tenderness that had pierced Elinor's heart. Mary, the name alone was enough to quicken Elinor's pulse. She was beautiful, yes, with her golden hair and wide, innocent eyes. But it was her effortless grace that had ensnared Roddy Wellman. Elinor's fiancé Roddy, with his boyish charm and wandering gaze, had been captivated from the moment they arrived at Hunterbury 2 weeks ago. Elinor had watched, helpless, as his attention drifted from her to Mary. his laughter brighter in the girl's presence, his touch lingering too long on her arm. The memory stung, a fresh wound atop the older ache of Aunt Laura's death. Elinor turned from the window, her hands clenching into fists. She was not one to wallow, but the weight of the past days pressed down on her. The anonymous letter, its cruel words accusing Mary of scheming for Aunt Laura's fortune, had planted a seed of doubt that now bloomed into something darker. And then there was the half-written letter she'd found in Aunt Laura's room, its cryptic lines suggesting a change in the will, one that favored Mary. Elinor had tucked it away, telling herself it was nothing, but the words lingered like a ghost. The drawing room was quiet when she entered, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock. Mrs. Bishop, the housekeeper, stood by the fireplace, her severe bun and starched apron giving her the air of a general surveying a battlefield. Her lips were a thin line, her eyes sharp with disapproval. "Miss Elinor," she said, her voice clipped, "the doctor will be here soon. Dr. Lord. He's been most attentive since the passing." Elinor nodded, forcing a polite smile. "Thank you, Mrs. Bishop. I'll see to the arrangements." Mrs. Bishop's gaze lingered, as if she could see the turmoil beneath Elinor's composed exterior. "It's a sad business," she said, her tone softening slightly. "Mrs. Wellman was a fine lady. Too kind, perhaps. There's talk among the staff, nothing I'd repeat. Mind you, but folk are saying her death wasn't natural." Elinor's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice sharper than intended. Mrs. Bishop hesitated, then shook her head. "Just talk, miss. People will gossip when there's grief about. Pay it no mind." But her eyes darted to the door, as if afraid of being overheard. Before Elinor could press further, the doorbell chimed, a low, mournful sound that echoed through the house. Mrs. Bishop bustled out, leaving Elinor alone with her thoughts. She sank into an armchair, the velvet cool against her skin, and tried to steady her breathing. The whispers of foul play were absurd, weren't they? Aunt Laura had been ill for months, her strength sapped by the first stroke. Yet the timing of her death, so soon after that whispered conversation with Mary, felt like a puzzle piece that didn't fit. Dr. Peter Lord arrived moments later, his presence a quiet balm. He was young, perhaps 30, with kind brown eyes and a demeanor that suggested both competence and compassion. His tweed jacket was slightly rumpled, as if he'd rushed from another call, but his smile was warm as he greeted her. "Miss Carlisle," he said, setting his medical bag on the sideboard. "I'm so sorry for your loss." Mrs. Wellman was remarkable. "Thank you, Dr. Lord," Elinor said, rising to meet him. His gaze held hers a moment too long, and she felt a flush creep up her neck. There was something in his eyes, concern, yes, but also something deeper, unspoken. She pushed the thought aside. "Have you examined her? Is there anything I should know?" Peter hesitated, his fingers brushing the handle of his bag. "The death certificate is straightforward. A second stroke is expected." But he paused, choosing his words carefully. "I'd like to speak with Nurse Hopkins and Nurse O'Brien, if I may, just to confirm the details of her final hours." Elinor's stomach tightened. "Of course, they're upstairs, I believe. Shall I fetch them?" "No need," he said. "Quickly I'll find them. You've enough to manage." He offered a reassuring smile, but it did little to ease the knot in her chest as Peter left the room. Elinor's gaze fell on the nurse's kit left on a side table, its contents neatly arranged: bandages, syringes, and a small vial of morphine glinting faintly in the morning light. She froze, her breath catching. Morphine. The word alone conjured images of quiet, painless death, a mercy some called it, but also a tool of darker intent. She shook her head, banishing the thought. She was being ridiculous, letting gossip and grief cloud her judgment. The day passed in a blur of duties. Elinor met with the solicitor, Mr. Dunn, who confirmed that Aunt Laura's will remained unchanged. The bulk of the estate went to Elinor and Roddy, with a generous bequest of £2,000 to marry Gerrard, at Laura's dying wish. What amount was startling, enough to fund Mary's dreams of studying abroad, and it fanned the flames of Elinor's unease. Why such a sum for the lodgekeeper's daughter? What had Aunt Laura seen in her that warranted such generosity? Roddy, meanwhile, was nowhere to be found. He'd taken to wandering the grounds with Mary, their laughter drifting through the open windows like a taunt. Elinor tried to focus on the estate's affairs, bills to pay, staff to manage, but her thoughts kept circling back to him. She loved him, or thought she did, but his distance was a blade, cutting deeper with each passing day. When he finally appeared at dinner, his eyes bright with some private joy, she could barely meet his gaze. "Mary's been telling me about her plans," he said, slicing into his roast with unnecessary vigor. "She wants to study nursing, perhaps in London. She's got such spirit, Elinor, don't you think?" Elinor's fork paused mid-air. "She's ambitious," she managed, her voice tight. Across the table, Nurse O'Brien, who'd joined them for the meal, raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Nurse Hopkins, seated beside her, offered a thin smile, her eyes darting to Elinor with a scrutiny that felt like a challenge. Mrs. Wellman thought the world of her. Nurse Hopkins said, her tone measured, said she deserved a chance to make something of herself. Elinor's grip on her fork tightened. Aunt Laura was always generous, she said, forcing a smile. Perhaps too generous. The words hung in the air, sharp and unintended. Roddy frowned, but before he could respond, Nurse O'Brien coughed, a nervous sound that broke the tension. "More wine, Miss Carlisle?" she asked, her Irish lilt softening the moment. "No, thank you," Elinor said, pushing her plate away. Her appetite was gone, replaced by a gnawing sense of betrayal. She excused herself, claiming a headache, and retreated to her room. There, in the dim glow of a single lamp, she sat on the edge of her bed, her hands trembling. The house was too quiet, the silence a canvas for her fears. Aunt Laura's death, Mary's bequest, Roddy's wandering heart. It was too much, too fast. She rose and crossed to the window where the cypress tree loomed in the moonlight, its branches swaying like mourners at a funeral. Below, she saw two figures near the lodge, Roddy and Mary, their heads bent close, their voices too low to hear. The sight was a punch to her gut, and she turned away, her eyes stinging with unshed tears. Sleep eluded her that night. She lay awake, replaying every moment of the past weeks, the anonymous letter, Aunt Laura's whispered words, the vial of morphine. Her mind spun with possibilities, each darker than the last. Had someone hastened her aunt's death? And if so, why? The money, the will, Mary's sudden prominence, it all pointed to a truth she wasn't ready to face. The next morning, as she dressed, a knock came at her door. It was Horlick, his cap in hand, his face etched with unease. "Miss Elinor," he said, his voice low, "I don't mean to trouble you, but I saw something odd last night. Nurse Hopkins, she was out by the lodge near midnight. Looked like she was hiding something. I thought you should know." Elinor's breath caught. "Hiding something? What do you mean?" Horlick shifted, uncomfortable. "Can't say for sure. A box maybe, or a bag. She was quick to cover it when she saw me watching. I don't trust her, miss, never have." "Thank you, Horlick," Elinor said, her voice steady despite the racing of her heart. "I'll look into it." As he left, she sank onto the bed, her thoughts a whirlwind. Nurse Hopkins, with her sharp eyes and guarded demeanor, had been a constant presence in Aunt Laura's final days. Could she know something about the morphine, the will, or Mary? Eleanor's gaze drifted to the nurse's kit, still on the side table downstairs. The vial of morphine gleamed in her memory, a silent accusation. She rose, her resolve hardening. She would find answers no matter the cost. But as she descended the stairs, the weight of Hunterberry's secrets pressed heavier, and the cypress tree outside seemed to whisper a warning she could not yet decipher. The days that followed were a blur of grief and suspicion. Elinor threw herself into managing the estate, hoping routine would anchor her. She met with tenants, reviewed accounts, and avoided Roddy, whose presence now felt like a betrayal. Peter Lord visited daily, his quiet strength a comfort she didn't dare acknowledge. He spoke little of Aunt Laura's death, but his questions about the nurses and the household staff were pointed, as if he, too, sensed something amiss. One afternoon, as Elinor sorted through Aunt Laura's papers, she found a locked diary tucked in a drawer. The leather cover was worn, the lock small but sturdy. Her heart raced as she pried it open with a letter opener, revealing pages filled with Laura's elegant script. Most were mundane notes on the estate, memories of her youth, but one entry, dated a week before her death, stopped Elinor cold. "Mary is my heart's secret," it read. "Lewis's child, though none must know. I've provided for her, but I fear for her safety. There are those who would harm her for what she represents. I must act before it's too late." Elinor's hands trembled as she read the words again. Lewis, Sir Lewis Rickroft, Aunt Laura's long-dead love. Mary, his daughter. The revelation was a thunderbolt, reshaping everything. The bequest, the whispers, the anonymous letter, it all pointed to a secret that had died with Laura. But had it? The diaries warning those who would harm her echoed in Elinor's mind, mingling with Horlick's tale of Nurse Hopkins's midnight errand. She closed the diary, her thoughts a storm. If Mary was Laura's daughter, the bequest made sense, but it also painted a target on her back. And Elinor, caught in the web of her own jealousy and grief, felt the walls of Hunterberry closing in. She needed answers, but every step toward the truth seemed to pull her deeper into a maze of lies. That evening, as the sun dipped below the hills, Elinor stood in the garden, the cypress tree casting long shadows across the lawn. Roddy approached, his expression sheepish. "Elinor," he said, his voice soft, "I know I've been distant. It's just, Mary's so different. She's full of dreams." "And I stop," Elinor said, her voice cold. "I don't want to hear it." He flinched, but before he could respond, a cry came from the house. It was Mrs. Bishop, her face pale as she rushed toward them. "Miss Elinor, it's Nurse Hopkins. She's taken ill. Dr. Lord's with her now, but it's bad." Elinor's heart pounded as she followed Mrs. Bishop inside. In the drawing room, Peter knelt beside Nurse Hopkins, who lay on the floor, her face ashen, her breath shallow. A teacup lay shattered nearby, its contents pooling on the rug. Peter looked up, his eyes grim. "It's morphine," he said quietly. "Someone's poisoned her." Elinor's world tilted. The vial of morphine, the diary, the whispers of foul play, it was all converging, a noose tightening around her. As Peter worked to save Nurse Hopkins, Eleanor's gaze drifted to the cypress tree outside, its branches swaying like a silent witness to the secrets unraveling within Hunterbury's walls. The chapter closed with Elinor standing alone, the weight of suspicion now unbearable. She was no closer to the truth, but the truth, it seemed, was closing in on her. Chapter 4. The fatal teeth. The sun hung low over Hunterbury, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns and the ivy-clad walls of the estate. The air was thick with the scent of roses and the faint hum of summer insects, but inside the grand house a different kind of tension simmered. Elinor Carlisle stood in the drawing-room, her hands clasped tightly, her knuckles pale against the dark fabric of her dress. The weight of the past few days pressed heavily on her shoulders, her aunt's death, Roddy's wandering eyes, and now the whispers that seemed to follow her every step through the village of Maidensford. Mary Gerrard, the lodgekeeper's daughter, sat across from her at the small mahogany table, her delicate hands folded neatly in her lap. The tea tray between them gleamed under the chandelier's soft glow, its silver teapot and delicate porcelain cups a stark contrast to the storm brewing in Elinor's heart. Mary's auburn hair caught the light, and her clear blue eyes held a quiet confidence that made Elinor's stomach twist. Roddy had been different since their arrival, distracted, his smiles reserved for Mary, his words to Elinor clipped and formal. The engagement ring on her finger felt like a shackle now, binding her to a man whose heart was slipping away. "More tea, Mary?" Elinor asked, her voice steady despite the tremor in her chest. She lifted the teapot, its spout hovering over Mary's cup. Mary smiled, a small, polite curve of her lips. "Yes, please. It's very kind of you, Elinor." Kind, the word stung. Elinor poured the tea, the amber liquid steaming as it filled the cup. Her mind flickered to the vial of morphine she'd seen in Nurse Hopkins's kit the day before, tucked among bandages and syringes in the sick room. It had been a fleeting glance, but the image lingered, a small glass bottle, its contents clear and deadly. She pushed the thought aside, focusing on the clink of the teapot against the saucer. Room was quiet, save for the ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. Outside, the garden was still, the roses bowing under the weight of their own blooms. Elinor's eyes drifted to the window, where she could see Roddy walking with Peter Lord, the local doctor, near the cypress tree that loomed over the estate. Roddy's laughter carried faintly through the glass, a sound that once warmed her but now felt like a blade. Peter's presence, however, was a quiet comfort. His steady gaze and gentle manner had been a balm during Aunt Laura's final days, and Elinor found herself grateful for his visits, though she scarcely admitted it to herself. Mary sipped her tea, oblivious to Elinor's scrutiny. "It's such a beautiful day," she said, her voice soft. "I was thinking of taking a walk later. The gardens here are so lovely." Elinor nodded, her lips tight. "They are. Aunt Laura always took such pride in them." Her voice faltered on her aunt's name. The memory of Laura Wellman's frail form in the sick room, her once vibrant eyes dulled by illness, was still raw. The will had been read that morning, confirming Elinor and Roddy as the primary heirs, but a generous bequest to Mary had raised eyebrows among the staff. Mrs. Bishop, the housekeeper, had pursed her lips in disapproval, muttering about charity cases under her breath. Horlick the gardener had simply shaken his head, his weathered hands tightening around his pruning shears. The bequest hadn't surprised Elinor, not entirely. Aunt Laura had always been fond of Mary, treating her almost like a daughter, but the whispers of a changed will, overheard in that fleeting moment before Laura's death, gnawed at her. Had Laura intended to give Mary even more? Had Mary known? Elinor's gaze flicked to the girl across the table, her beauty almost ethereal in the afternoon light. It was easy to see why Roddy was captivated. Too easy. "Elinor, are you all right?" Mary's voice broke through her thoughts, tinged with concern. "You seem distant." Elinor forced a smile, her fingers tightening around her teacup. "I'm fine, just tired. It's been a difficult week." Mary nodded, her expression sympathetic. "I understand. Losing Mrs. Wellman must be so hard for you. She was such a kind woman." Kind, there was that word again. Elinor set her cup down, the porcelain clinking sharply against the saucer. "Yes, she was," she said, her voice clipped. "She was very fond of you, Mary. That bequest, it was generous." Mary's cheeks flushed, and she looked down at her hands. "I was so surprised. I never expected. I mean, I'm grateful, of course, but it's overwhelming." Elinor's smile tightened. "Of course." The conversation lapsed into silence, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. Elinor's mind raced, replaying Roddy's lingering glances at Mary, the way his hand had brushed hers in the garden yesterday. She thought of the anonymous letter, its cruel words scrawled in jagged ink. "She's after your fortune, and she'll take him to—" At the time, Elinor had dismissed it as spiteful gossip, but now, watching Mary sip her tea, the seeds of doubt took root. The door creaked open, and Nurse Hopkins entered, her starched apron rustling. Her sharp eyes darted between the two women, and Elinor caught a flicker of something: disapproval, perhaps, or calculation. "Miss Carlisle," she said, her tone brisk, "I've just come from the village. The chemist asked after you. Said he'd have the tonic for your nerves ready by tomorrow." Elinor's jaw tightened. She hadn't asked for a tonic, but Nurse Hopkins had insisted. citing her pale complexion and restless manner. It was another reminder of how closely the household watched her, how every move was scrutinized. "Thank you, nurse," she said coolly. "I'll collect it myself." Nurse Hopkins nodded, her lips pursed. "Very well. I'll be upstairs if you need me, Miss Gerrard. Don't tire yourself, you've had a long day." Mary smiled. "I'm fine, nurse, thank you." As Nurse Hopkins left, Eleanor's gaze returned to the tea tray. The sugar bowl sat untouched, its lid slightly askew. She thought of the morphine again, the vial's cold glass against her fingertips. When she'd brushed it accidentally while helping Nurse O'Brien tidy the sick, a dangerous thought flickered in her mind, unbidden but persistent. She pushed it away, horrified, but it lingered like a shadow. "Elinor, I was thinking," Mary said, breaking the silence. "With the money from Mrs. Wellman, I might be able to study abroad, perhaps in Paris or Vienna. I've always wanted to see the world." Eleanor's heart sank. The idea of Mary leaving should have brought relief, but instead, it stoked her fear. If Mary left, would Roddy follow? Would he abandon their engagement, their future, for a girl he barely knew? "That sounds wonderful," she managed her voice hollow. "You must be excited." Mary's eyes sparkled. It feels like a dream. I owe so much to Mrs. Wellman." The words were innocent, but to Elinor they felt like a challenge. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the polished floor. "I should check on the arrangements for dinner," she said, avoiding Mary's gaze. "Excuse me." She left the room, her heart pounding, and made her way to the kitchen, where Mrs. Bishop was overseeing the preparation of the evening meal. The housekeeper's stern face softened slightly at Elinor's entrance, but her eyes remained sharp. "Everything all right, Miss Carlisle?" she asked, wiping her hands on her apron. "Yes, thank you," Elinor replied, her voice tight. "I just needed some air." Mrs. Bishop nodded, but her gaze lingered, as if she could sense the turmoil beneath Elinor's composed exterior. "That Gerrard girl," she said, her tone low. "She's been spending a lot of time with Mr. Wellman. Not proper, if you ask me." Elinor's stomach twisted, but she forced a nod. "They're just friends, Mrs. Bishop, nothing more." The housekeeper sniffed, unconvinced, and turned back to her work. Elinor left the kitchen, her steps quickening as she headed for the sick room. It was empty now, Aunt Laura's bed stripped bare, the air heavy with the scent of antiseptic. The nurse's kit sat on a side table, its contents neatly arranged. Elinor's eyes fell on the vial of morphine, still there, its label stark against the glass. Her fingers twitched, and for a moment, she imagined slipping it into her pocket, the weight of it grounding her spiraling thoughts. She shook her head, stepping back. What was she thinking? She wasn't a murderer. She wasn't cruel, but the doubt, the jealousy, the fear, they clawed at her, relentless. She turned and left the room, her breath uneven, and made her way back to the drawing room. Mary was still there, her teacup empty, her expression serene. "I think I'll take that walk now," she said, standing. "Would you like to join me?" Elinor hesitated, then shook her head. "No, thank you. I have things to do." Mary nodded, her smile warm, and left the room, her footsteps light on the hardwood floor. Elinor watched her go, her heart a battleground of emotions. She sat back down at the tea tray, her hands trembling as she poured herself another cup. The steam rose curling in the air like a ghost, and she stared at it, her thoughts dark and tangled. Hours later, the scream shattered the quiet of Hunterbury. It came from the garden, high and piercing, cutting through the evening stillness. Elinor leapt to her feet, her teacup clattering to the floor, and ran toward the sound. Mrs. Bishop and Horlick were already there, their faces pale, as Nurse Hopkins knelt beside Mary's crumpled form on the lawn. The tea tray lay nearby, its contents spilled across the grass, the porcelain cup shattered. "She's not breathing," Nurse Hopkins cried, her hands pressing against Mary's chest. "Someone fetch Dr. Lord." Elinor stood frozen, her pulse roaring in her ears. Mary's face was pale, her lips faintly blue, her eyes staring blankly at the sky. The vial of morphine flashed in Elinor's mind, and a cold dread settled over her. She hadn't touched it, she hadn't, but the thought had crossed her mind. And now Mary was dead. Peter Lord arrived within minutes, his medical bag in hand, his face grim as he examined Mary. "Morphine poisoning," he said quietly, his voice heavy with sorrow. "She's gone." The words hit Elinor like a blow, and she staggered back, her hand clutching the cypress tree for support. The village would talk, the police would come, and all eyes would turn to her Elinor Carlisle, the jilted fiancé, the woman who had poured the tea. The hours that followed were a blur. The police arrived, their questions sharp and relentless. They searched the house, their eyes lingering on the tea tray, the kitchen, the sick room. They found the vial of morphine, its contents partially gone, and Elinor's fingerprints on the glass. He tried to explain she'd only touched it by accident, helping Nurse O'Brien, but the words sounded hollow, even to her own ears. "You prepared the tea, Miss Carlisle," the inspector said, his voice cold, "and you were alone with Miss Gerrard before she died. Can you explain that?" Elinor's mouth was dry, her heart pounding. I wouldn't, but the evidence was damning. The village buzzed with gossip, the whispers growing louder with each passing hour. Elinor Carlisle, the heiress, the scorned lover, the murderer. Roddy's face was pale, his eyes avoiding hers, and Elinor felt the last threads of their engagement unravel. Peter Lord found her later, sitting alone in the library, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Eleanor," he said softly, his voice a lifeline in the storm, "I don't believe you did this. I know you didn't." She looked up at him, her eyes brimming with tears. "How can you be sure?" she whispered. "I thought about it, Peter. I thought about it." He knelt beside her, his hand resting gently on hers. "Thoughts aren't actions. You're not a killer, Elinor. I'll find a way to prove it." She shook her head, her voice breaking. "It's too late. They've made up their minds." Peter's jaw tightened, a fierce determination in his eyes. "It's not too late. I know someone who can help, someone who sees what others miss." Elinor frowned, confused. "Who?" "Hercule Poirot," Peter said, his voice steady. "He's a detective, a brilliant one. I've sent for him. He'll find the truth, Elinor, I promise." She stared at him, a flicker of hope stirring in her chest, but it was faint, overshadowed by the weight of suspicion, the memory of the morphine vial, and the cold, accusing eyes of the village. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "All right." The chapter closed with the sound of a car approaching Hunterbury, its headlights cutting through the dusk. Hercule Poirot stepped out, his small, precise figure a stark contrast to the sprawling estate. His mustache twitched as he surveyed the scene, his sharp eyes missing nothing: the cypress tree, the spilled tea, the shadow of guilt that hung over Elinor. He turned to Peter, his voice calm but resolute. "Monsieur Lord, you have called me to a matter most grave, but fear not the truth. It hides, but it cannot run from Hercule Poirot." Elinor watched from the window, her heart a fragile thing, caught between despair and a glimmer of hope. The fatal tea had changed everything, and now, with Poirot's arrival, the unraveling of the truth was only beginning. Chapter 5. Poirot's first steps. Hercule Poirot stepped into the shadowed drawing-room of Hunterbury, his polished shoes clicking softly on the polished oak floor. The air carried the faint scent of lavender and wax, a deceptive calm over the estate's simmering secrets. His grey eyes, sharp as a falcon's, swept across the room, noting the heavy velvet curtains, the mahogany table cluttered with teacups, and the portrait of Laura Wellman gazing down with serene authority. The weight of her absence lingered, as did the echo of Mary Gerrard's tragic end. Poirot adjusted his mustache, his mind already slicing through the tangle of motives and lies. Elinor Carlisle sat in a backed chair, her pale hands folded tightly in her lap. The strain of her arrest was etched into her face, dark circles under her eyes, her lips pressed thin. She wore a simple grey dress, its austerity a stark contrast to the vibrant young woman who had once laughed freely at Hunterbury across. From her, Peter Lord fidgeted, his boyish face clouded with worry. He had summoned Poirot, his faith in Elinor's innocence unwavering, though the evidence against her was damning. The morphine, the tea, the jealousy over Roddy's wandering heart. "Monsieur Poirot," Peter began, his voice low but urgent, "you must see it. She couldn't have done this. Elinor is not a murderer. She's too good for that." Poirot raised a hand, his gesture both commanding and gentle. "Calm yourself, Dr. Lord. The heart, it may speak, but it is the little grey cells that will find the truth. Tell me, Mademoiselle Carlisle, everything you recall of that fatal day." Elinor's gaze flickered to the window where the cypress tree loomed against a grey sky. Her voice, when it came, was steady but hollow. "It was a warm afternoon. Mary came to the house for tea. I prepared it myself, sandwiches, scones, the usual things. She seemed happy, excited even. She spoke of her plans to study in London, perhaps abroad. I didn't think much of it then. But Roddy," her voice faltered, and she swallowed hard. "Roddy was enchanted by her. Everyone could see it." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "On the tea, mademoiselle. You poured it, you handled the cups." "Yes," Elinor admitted, her fingers tightening, "but I didn't. Who put anything in it? I swear it. I was angry, yes, but not enough to kill her." Peter leaned forward, his voice pleading. "She's telling the truth, Poirot. You've got to believe her." "Belief," Poirot said softly, "is a luxury I cannot afford. Facts, Dr. Lord, facts are my currency." He turned to Elinor. "Tell me of the others present, the nurses, the staff, every detail. S'il vous plaît." Elinor recounted the day. Nurse Hopkins, brisk and efficient, had been in and out of the kitchen, overseeing Laura's care before her death. Nurse O'Brien, with her Irish lilt and nervous chatter, had lingered nearby, offering to help with the tea but never touching it. Mrs. Bishop, the housekeeper, had been tidying the drawing-room, her disapproval of Mary's presence palpable. Horlick, the gardener, had been outside pruning roses near the terrace, and Roddy had been there, his eyes fixed on Mary. Oblivious to Elinor's growing despair, Poirot listened intently, his head tilted slightly, as if catching whispers others missed. When Elinor finished, he rose and paced the room, his steps deliberate. "The tea, mademoiselle. It was drunk here, in this room." "Yes," Elinor said. "We sat at that table. Mary took one sip, maybe two, and then she collapsed. It was so sudden I didn't know what to do." Poirot approached the table, his fingers brushing the edge of a porcelain teacup. "And the morphine?" Where was it kept? In the nurse's kit, Elinor said. In the upstairs hall, near Aunt Laura's room. I saw it there once or twice, but I never touched it. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Never, mademoiselle, not even in a moment of curiosity. Elinor flushed, her voice sharp. No, never. Peter stood, his hands clenched. Poirot, she's answered your questions. Can't you see she's suffering? Poirot's gaze softened, but only for a moment. Suffering, Dr. Lord, is a universal language, but murder it speaks in specifics. I must speak with the others, the nurses, the housekeeper, the gardener, and this Roddy Wellman who seems to have stirred so many hearts. The interviews began that afternoon, each conducted in the library, where bookshelves towered like silent witnesses. Nurse Hopkins entered first, her starched uniform crisp, her face a mask of professional detachment. She was a stout woman in her 40s, with sharp blue eyes and a no-nonsense air. Poirot greeted her with a courteous nod, but his questions were relentless. Nurse Hopkins, you were present when Mademoiselle Gerrard drank the tea. Did you observe anything unusual? Hopkins folded her arms, her tone clipped. Nothing out of the ordinary. Miss Carlisle prepared the tea. Mary drank it. Then she took ill. That's all I saw. And the morphine? Poirot asked, his voice smooth as silk. You handled it. We for Madame Wellman's care. Of course, Hopkins said. It was in the kit, locked away. Only Nurse O'Brien and I had access. And the doctor, naturally. Naturally, Poirot echoed, his eyes narrowing. Yet the morphine found its way into the tea. Curious, Nan. Tell me, Nurse Hopkins, did you like Mary Gerrard? Hopkins hesitated, her lips pursing. She was a nice enough girl, ambitious, perhaps too pretty for her own good. Poirot's moustache twitched. Too pretty, a dangerous quality, perhaps. And Mademoiselle Carlisle, did you sense her displeasure with Mary? Hopkins's eyes darted away. I don't gossip about my employers, Monsieur Poirot. Miss Carlisle was upset about Mr. Wellman's attentions, that's plain. But murder, that's a leap. A leap perhaps, Poirot said, but one I must consider. Mercy, Nurse Hopkins. You may go. Next came Nurse O'Brien, her auburn hair tucked under her cap, her hands twisting nervously. She spoke in a rush, her Irish accent thick with anxiety. Oh, Monsieur Poirot, it's a terrible thing, it is. Poor Mary, so young and full of life. I can't believe Miss Carlisle would do such a thing. But, well, she was jealous, wasn't she? Mr. Wellman couldn't take his eyes off Mary. Poirot leaned forward, his voice gentle but probing. And you, Nurse O'Brien, what did you see in the kitchen that day? Not much, O'Brien said, her cheeks flushing. I offered to help with the tea, but Miss Carlisle said she'd manage. I was in and out, checking on Mrs. Wellman, God rest her soul. I saw the sandwiches, the teapot, nothing strange. And the morphine? Poirot asked. You saw it in the kit? Yes, sir, locked tight. It was. I checked it myself that morning. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Locked tight. Yet the key. Nurse O'Brien, where was it kept? O'Brien faltered, her hand stilling. In the drawer. By the kit. But no one touched it, I swear. No one. Poirot pressed, his tone deceptively mild. Not even you. In a moment of distraction. O'Brien's eyes widened. Me? No, sir. I'd never. Mercy. Nurse O'Brien. Poirot interrupted, dismissing her with a wave. Her nervous chatter lingered in his mind, a thread to tug later. Mrs. Bishop, the housekeeper, was next, her posture rigid, her grey hair pulled into a severe bun. She spoke with icy precision, her disdain for Mary Gerrard barely concealed. That girl had no business in the house, a lodgekeeper's daughter, mixing with her betters. Mrs. Wellman spoiled her, giving her ideas above her station. And Mademoiselle Carlisle, Poirot asked, did she share your disapproval? Mrs. Bishop's lips thinned. Miss Elinor is a lady, but she's human. She saw how Mr. Wellman fawned over Mary. It hurt her, naturally, but she'd never stoop to poison. Poirot tilted his head. You are certain, Madame Bishop? The heart, it can lead us to dark places. Mrs. Bishop's eyes flashed. I've known Miss Elinor since she was a child. She's no killer. Horlick, the gardener, was less forthcoming, his weathered hands fidgeting as he spoke of pruning roses near the terrace. I saw Miss Mary and Mr. Wellman talking by the fountain, he said gruffly. She was laughing, all bright like Miss Carlisle watched from the window. Didn't look happy. Poirot nodded, filing the image away. And the kitchen, Monsieur Horlick? Did you enter it that day? No, sir, my place is outside. Don't meddle with the house folk. The interviews concluded with Roddy Wellman, whose charm had faded under the weight of grief and guilt. He entered the library with a slouch, his boyish good looks marred by sleeplessness. I didn't mean to hurt Elinor, he said, his voice low. Mary was different, vibrant. I was drawn to her, that's all. Poirot's eyes were cold. Drawn, Monsieur Wellman, enough to blind you to Mademoiselle Carlisle's pain. Roddy flinched. I didn't know it would come to this. I thought Elinor was stronger. Strength, Poirot said, is not immunity to betrayal. Tell me, what did you and Mademoiselle Gerrard discuss by the fountain? Roddy hesitated, his fingers brushing his cuff. Her dreams. She wanted to study, to travel. Aunt Laura was going to help her. I encouraged it. And Mademoiselle Carlisle, Poirot asked, did she know of these plans? Roddy's gaze dropped. I mentioned it to her. She didn't take it well. Poirot dismissed him, his mind churning. The pieces were scattered, but patterns were forming. The morphine, the tea, the jealousy to neat. Perhaps he needed more. That evening Poirot wandered the estate, his cane tapping the gravel path. The cypress tree loomed ahead, its branches swaying like mourners. He paused at Mary's room, now sealed by the police, but a quick word with Peter Lord granted him access. Inside the air was stale, the bed neatly made. Poirot's eyes scanned the sparse furnishings. A dresser, a mirror, a small desk. On the desk lay a photograph, its edge torn, showing Mary laughing beside a man in a dark suit. The man's face was obscured, the tear deliberate. Poirot slipped the photograph into his pocket, his pulse quickening. A clue. At last he returned, through the drawing room, where Peter waited, his anxiety palpable. Well, Poirot, what do you think? Poirot's smile was enigmatic. I think, Dr. Lord, that the truth is like a cypress tree, beautiful but heavy with sorrow. This photograph, it tells a story, but who's Peter's brow furrowed? You think it's connected to the murder? Everything is connected. Poirot said, the question is, how? Tell me, Doctor, what do you know of Sir Lewis Rycroft? Peter blinked, caught off guard. Sir Lewis? He was a friend of Aunt Laura's, years ago. Died in a hunting accident, I think. Why? Eyes gleamed. Because, mon ami, the past has a way of whispering into the present. Sir Lewis, Mary Gerrard, Laura Wellman, their stories intertwine, and someone wished to silence that truth. He turned to Elinor, who had entered silently, her face pale. Mademoiselle, did Mary ever speak of her parents? Elinor shook her head, her voice barely audible. No, she was raised by the Gerrards, but there were rumors. People said she wasn't their daughter. Not really. Poirot nodded, his mind racing. The photograph, the morphine, the whispered grudges, it was a puzzle, but not in. He would need to dig deeper, to probe the shadows of Hunterberry's past. For now, he had a thread to pull, the man in the photograph, and the secret he carried as night fell. Poirot stood alone on the terrace, the cypress tree a dark silhouette, against the moon. The little grey cells, he murmured, they are never silent. The truth was close, but it would demand patience and perhaps a touch of danger to uncover. The next morning, Poirot visited the local post office, where Mary had often mailed letters. The postmistress, a wiry woman named Mrs. Slattery, remembered her well. Such a sweet girl, she said, her eyes misty, always sending letters to London, to some school or other, and once a letter to New Zealand. Odd, that New Zealand. Poirot's interest sharpened. Do you recall the name? Mrs. Slattery frowned. Can't say I do, but it was a long name, foreign-like. Started with an R, I think. Poirot thanked her, his mind buzzing. New Zealand, Sir Lewis Rycroft, a torn photograph. The threads were tightening. He returned to Hunterberry, where Elinor sat in the garden, her hands clasped around a cup of tea. She looked up as he approached, her eyes wary. Monsieur Poirot, have you found something? Perhaps, he said, his tone light but his gaze piercing. Mademoiselle, did you ever notice Mary writing letters to someone far away? Perhaps. Elinor frowned. She mentioned a pen pal once, someone she'd met through a school program. I didn't think much of it. Why? Poirot did not answer directly. The heart, mademoiselle. It hides as much as it reveals, but the truth, it cannot hide forever. He left her there, under the cypress tree, and returned to the library to study the photograph again. The man's suit was old-fashioned, perhaps from the 1920s. A lover, a father, a threat. Poirot's fingers traced the tear, his mind constructing a timeline. Mary's death was no accident, but neither was it as simple as jealousy. Someone had orchestrated it, someone with a secret to protect. Over the next few days, Poirot pieced together fragments of Mary's life. She had been adopted by the Gerrards, that much was clear. But whispers in the village suggested a deeper connection to Hunterberry. Old Mr. Seddon, the family solicitor, confirmed Laura Wellman's fondness for Mary, but he clammed up when pressed about Sir Lewis Rycroft. Old history, he muttered, best left buried. But Poirot was not one to leave secrets buried. He sent a telegram to a contact in London, requesting records on Sir Lewis Rycroft's estate. If Mary was connected to him, there would be traces, letters, diaries, perhaps a will. Meanwhile, he watched Nurse Hopkins closely, noting her unease whenever Mary's name was mentioned. Her brisk efficiency seemed a mask, one that slipped in fleeting moments. One evening, as Poirot sat in the drawing room, Peter burst in, his face flushed with excitement. Poirot, I've found something. In the attic, there's a box of Laura's old letters. I didn't read them, but they mentioned Sir Lewis. Poirot's eyes lit up. Show me, mon ami. The attic was dusty, its air thick with the scent of aged paper. The box was small, its contents a treasure trove of Laura Wellman's youth. Poirot sifted through the letters, his gloved hands careful. Most were mundane, notes to friends, invitations to balls, but one caught his eye. Dated 1905, it was from Sir Lewis, his handwriting elegant but urgent. My dearest Laura, it read, our time is short, but my heart is yours. If fate allows, we will build a life together. But if not, know that our secret will be safe. Poirot's pulse quickened. A secret to child, perhaps. He read on, finding references to a little one and a safe haven abroad. New Zealand. Perhaps the pieces were falling into place, but the picture was still incomplete. He confronted Nurse Hopkins the next day, his tone deceptively casual. "Madame, you knew of Mary's true parentage, did you not?" Hopkins's face paled, but she recovered quickly. "I don't know what you mean, Monsieur Poirot." "Oh, I think you do," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. "You were Laura Wellman's confidant. You knew of her love for Sir Lewis, and of the child they could not claim." Hopkins's hands trembled, but she said nothing. Poirot pressed on. "Mary was their daughter, was she not? And someone perhaps you feared she would uncover the truth." "You're fishing," Hopkins snapped, but her voice cracked. "Had nothing to do with her death." "Then why?" Poirot said, producing the torn photograph. "Did you hide this?" Hopkins froze, her eyes fixed on the image. For a moment Poirot thought she might bolt, but she sank into a chair, her shoulders slumping. "I didn't kill her," she whispered. "But I knew things. Things Mrs. Wellman told me in confidence." "Tell me," Poirot said, his voice firm but kind. "The truth, madame. It is the only way." Hopkins's story spilled out in halting fragments. Laura Wellman and Sir Lewis Rycroft had been lovers, their affair hidden from society. When Laura discovered she was pregnant, Sir Lewis arranged for the child Mary to be raised by the Gerrards' trusted servants. Laura provided for her secretly, but as Mary grew, her resemblance to Sir Lewis became undeniable. Laura's decision to fund Mary's education had stirred old fears, and someone Hopkins wouldn't say who had panicked, who Poirot demanded, who feared Mary's truth. Hopkins shook her head, tears in her eyes. "I can't say. I swore to Mrs. Wellman." Poirot let her go, but her words echoed in his mind. The truth was close, but danger closer. He needed to find the man in the photograph and the letter to New Zealand. They held the key to Mary's death, and to Eleanor's freedom. As he left the room, Poirot glanced at the cypress tree through the window, its branches heavy with secrets. "Patience," he murmured. "The little grey cells will prevail." The investigation continued, each day bringing new fragments of the puzzle. Poirot learned from the village chemist that Nurse Hopkins had purchased a small quantity of morphine months earlier, claiming it was for a patient. The chemist's records were vague, but Poirot's suspicions grew. He visited Mary's old school, where her teacher spoke of her intelligence and her mysterious benefactor Laura Wellman, no doubt. A classmate recalled Mary's excitement over a letter from New Zealand, but the details were lost. Back at Hunterbury, Eleanor's trial loomed, her fate hanging by a thread. Peter Lord hovered near her, his devotion a quiet strength. Poirot watched them, his heart stirred by their unspoken bond. But sentiment would not solve the case. He needed evidence, and he needed it soon. One night, as rain lashed the estate, Poirot sat in the library, the torn photograph on the desk before him. He traced the man's silhouette, his mind racing. Sir Lewis Rycroft was dead, but someone else had known Mary's secret. Someone who feared exposure. Nurse Hopkins, Roddy, or another, hidden in the shadows. A knock at the door startled him. It was Horlick, his face grim. "Monsieur Poirot, I found something in the garden shed. Thought you should see it." Poirot followed him through the rain, his coat flapping. In the shed, Horlick pointed to a small tin box half buried under tools. Inside was a single letter, its envelope faded but intact. The postmark read, Auckland, New Zealand, 1925. The sender's name was smudged, but the letter was addressed to Mary Gerrard. Poirot opened it carefully, his heart pounding. The words were brief but devastating. "My dear girl, you must never know the truth of your birth. It would ruin too many lives. Stay safe, and stay silent." The signature was illegible, but Poirot knew he had found the key. Mary's death was no crime of passion, it was a desperate act to bury a secret, and the killer was still at Hunterbury, watching his every move. As he returned to the house, the cypress tree loomed in the darkness, its branches whispering warnings. Poirot's resolve hardened. The truth would come, and with it, justice. Chapter 6. The courtroom opens. The courtroom in Maidensford was a cavernous chamber, its high ceilings and polished oak panels lending it an air of solemn authority. Dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the tall arched windows, casting long shadows across the rows of spectators who filled the benches. The air was thick with anticipation, a palpable tension that seemed to hum beneath the low murmurs of the crowd. At the center of it all stood Elinor Carlisle, her face pale but composed, her hands clasped tightly before her as she faced the weight of accusation. She wore a simple grey dress, its severity a stark contrast to the vibrant life she once led at Hunterbury. Her eyes, though weary, held a flicker of defiance, as if daring the world to judge her. The prosecution's table was a fortress of documents and stern faces, led by Sir Edwin Bulmer, a barrister whose reputation for ruthless precision preceded him. His sharp features and piercing gaze seemed to dissect Elinor from across the room, as if he could see the guilt he believed resided in her heart. Opposite him, at the defense table, sat Mr. Harold Seddon, a man whose quiet demeanor belied his fierce determination to save his client. Beside him, Elinor's solicitor, Mr. Wargrave, scribbled notes, his brow furrowed with concentration. In the gallery, Hercule Poirot sat unobtrusively, his small, neat figure almost lost among the crowd, yet his sharp eyes missed nothing. He observed the proceedings with a calm detachment, his mind already sifting through the threads of the case, searching for the one that would unravel the truth. The judge, Sir Alistair Montague, entered with a rustle of robes, his presence commanding silence. His face, lined with years of dispensing justice, was impassive, though his eyes lingered briefly on Elinor, as if measuring her against the charges laid before her. The clerk's voice rang out, clear and formal, announcing the case. The Crown versus Elinor Catherine Carlisle, charged with the murder of Mary Gerrard by the administration of morphine on the 27th of July. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd, quickly hushed by the judge's gavel. Sir Edwin rose, his voice smooth and commanding as he began his opening statement. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his tone carrying the weight of certainty, "the case before you is one of cold, calculated murder, driven by the oldest of motives, jealousy and greed. Elinor Carlisle, a woman of means and opportunity, stood to lose everything: her inheritance, her love, her future, to the young and vibrant Mary Gerrard. We will prove, beyond a reasonable doubt, that Miss Carlisle, consumed by envy, poisoned Mary Gerrard with morphine, a substance to which she had easy access, in a deliberate act of malice." He painted a vivid picture of Elinor as a scorned lover, her engagement to Roderick Wellman crumbling under the weight of his infatuation with Mary. He described the tea party at Hunterbury, where Elinor alone prepared the fatal brew, her hands steady as she poured the poison that would end Mary's life. "The evidence is overwhelming," he declared, gesturing toward a stack of papers. "Witnesses will testify to Miss Carlisle's opportunity, her motive, and her actions. The morphine vial, found in the nurse's kit, bore her fingerprints. The tea, served by her hand, was the vehicle of death, and her demeanor, cold, detached, unfeeling, betrays the heart of a killer." Elinor sat motionless, her gaze fixed on a point beyond the courtroom, as if she could will herself away from the words that sought to condemn her. In the gallery, Peter Lord shifted uncomfortably, his hands clenched into fists. He had begged Poirot to take the case, his faith in Elinor's innocence unshaken despite the damning evidence. Beside him, Poirot's expression remained unreadable, though his fingers tapped lightly on the arm of his chair, a subtle sign of his mind at work. The prosecution called its first witness, Mrs. Bishop, the housekeeper of Hunterbury. She took the stand with the air of a woman who prided herself on propriety, her lips pursed in disapproval. Under Sir Edwin's questioning, she recounted Elinor's behavior in the days leading up to Mary's death. "Miss Carlisle was not herself," she said, her voice clipped. "She was short with the staff, distracted, and I saw her watching Miss Gerrard with a look I can only describe as venomous. She was always near the nurse's kit, too, checking it," she said, "but I thought it odd." "Did you ever see Miss Carlisle handle the morphine?" Sir Edwin asked. Mrs. Bishop hesitated, her eyes flicking toward Elinor. "I saw her near the kit the day before Miss Gerrard's death. She was holding a vial, examining it closely. I thought nothing of it at the time, but now—" Her voice trailed off, leaving the implication hanging in the air. Mr. Seddon rose for cross-examination, his tone gentle but firm. "Mrs. Bishop, you say Miss Carlisle was not herself. Could this not be attributed to the strain of her aunt's illness and death? And is it not true that the nurse's kit was accessible to many in the household, including the nurses themselves?" Mrs. Bishop bristled. "I suppose so, but Miss Carlisle was the one in charge. She was always giving orders, checking everything. It was her responsibility." Seddon pressed further, eliciting from Mrs. Bishop that she had no direct evidence of Elinor tampering with the morphine, only suspicions born of her dislike for Elinor's modern ways. The housekeeper stepped down, her testimony leaving a bitter taste but lacking the definitive weight Sir Edwin had hoped for. Next came Nurse O'Brien, her nervous energy palpable as she fidgeted on the stand. Her Irish lilt filled the courtroom as she described the day of Mary's death. "Miss Carlisle made the tea herself," she said, her eyes darting to Elinor. "She insisted on it, said it was her duty as hostess. I saw her cut the sandwiches, pour the tea, everything. Miss Gerrard took one sip and said it tasted bitter, but she drank it anyway." "And what of the morphine?" Sir Edwin asked. "Did you see Miss Carlisle with the vial?" "I didn't see her take it," Nurse O'Brien admitted, "but it was in the kit, and she was always poking about in there. She said she was making sure we had enough supplies, but it struck me as strange." Under cross-examination, Seddon leaned hard on Nurse O'Brien's vagueness. "You say Miss Carlisle was poking about in the kit. Did you see her remove anything? Did you see her administer anything to Miss Gerrard?" "No, sir," Nurse O'Brien mumbled, her cheeks flushing, "but she was the only one who could have done it. The kit was locked, and she had the key. And yet," Seddon countered, "you and Nurse Hopkins also had access to the key, did you not? And is it not true that you and Nurse Hopkins were alone with Miss Gerrard for much of the day?" Nurse O'Brien stammered, her confidence shaken, and Seddon dismissed her with a nod, planting a seed of doubt in the jury's minds. Poirot, watching from the gallery, leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing as he noted the nurse's discomfort. There was something in her manner, he thought, a flicker of guilt, perhaps, or fear. The prosecution's case continued with forensic evidence, a chemist who confirmed the presence of morphine in Mary's system, and a police inspector who detailed the discovery of the vial in the nurse's kit, its label smudged but bearing traces of Elinor's fingerprints. The inspector's testimony was methodical, damning in its precision, and the courtroom buzzed with renewed whispers. Elinor's composure faltered for the first time, her hands trembling slightly as she gripped the edge of the dock. Then came Peter Lord, called as a witness for the prosecution, but clearly reluctant. His broad shoulders and earnest face drew sympathetic glances from the jury as he took the stand. Sir Edwin's questions were sharp, probing Peter's interactions with Elinor and Mary. Dr. Lord, you were a frequent visitor to Hunterbury. Did you observe any tension between Miss Carlisle and Miss Gerrard? Peter hesitated, his eyes meeting Elinor's across the room. There was strain, he admitted. Miss Carlisle was under a great deal of pressure with her aunt's illness and the responsibilities of the estate. But I never saw her act with malice toward Mary. And yet, Sir Edwin pressed, you were aware of Miss Carlisle's engagement to Mr. Wellman and his growing affection for Miss Gerrard. Did this not cause Miss Carlisle distress? Peter's jaw tightened. It would distress anyone, he said evenly. But Elinor, Miss Carlisle is not a murderer. She cared for her aunt, for the estate, for everyone under her care. I believe in her innocence. The sincerity in his voice was undeniable, and a murmur of approval rippled through the gallery. Poirot's lips curved slightly, not in amusement, but in recognition of Peter's loyalty, a quality that could be both an asset and a blind spot. Sir Edwin, sensing the jury's sympathy, dismissed Peter quickly, but not before the young doctor's words had left their mark as the day drew to a close. The prosecution rested its case, and the courtroom adjourned. Elinor was led back to her cell, her steps heavy but her head held high. Peter lingered outside, his face etched with worry, until Poirot approached him, his small frame almost comical beside Peter's broad one. You did well, mon ami, Poirot said softly, his eyes gleaming with purpose. But there is more to this than meets the eye. The truth lies in the details, and I have seen a discrepancy in Nurse Hopkins's account of the tea's preparation. Tomorrow, we shall see what else she hides. Peter's eyes lit with hope, though his voice was strained. You think there's a chance, Poirot, for Elinor? There is always a chance, Poirot replied, his tone measured. But we must be precise. The little grey cells, they work tirelessly, and they will not rest until the truth is laid bare. In her cell, Elinor sat alone, the weight of the day pressing down on her. The prosecution's words echoed in her mind, each one a barb that pierced her resolve. She thought of Roddy, his charming smile now a distant memory, and of Mary, whose beauty had haunted her even in death. Had she hated Mary? The question gnawed at her, blurring the line between jealousy and guilt. She remembered the vial of morphine, its cool glass under her fingers as she checked the nurse's kit, a routine task, nothing more. Or was it? Doubt crept in, insidious and cold, and she pressed her hands to her face, willing it away. Outside, the town of Maidensford settled into dusk, its streets quiet but for the occasional whisper of gossip. The case had gripped the village, its details dissected in pubs and parlors. Elinor Carlisle, once the poised heiress of Hunterbury, was now a figure of scandal, her fate hanging in the balance. In the gallery, Poirot had watched it all, his mind a whirl of observations. The tremor in Nurse O'Brien's voice, the hesitation in Mrs. Bishop's testimony, the smudged label on the morphine vial. And then there was Nurse Hopkins, whose account of the tea's preparation had shifted ever so slightly under questioning, a detail that to Poirot was as glaring as a beacon. He returned to his modest lodgings, a small room above the local inn, and spread his notes across the table. The case was a puzzle, its pieces scattered and deceptive, but Poirot thrived on such challenges. He lit a cigarette, the smoke curling upward as he considered the timeline. The tea had been prepared at 3 o'clock, served at 3:30, and Mary had collapsed by 4. Nurse Hopkins had claimed she was in the kitchen the entire time, overseeing the sandwiches, but Nurse O'Brien had placed her in the drawing room at a critical moment. A small discrepancy, perhaps, but to Poirot, it was a crack in the facade of truth. He thought of Elinor, her pale face in the dock, and of Peter Lord, whose devotion to her was as clear as day. There was something admirable in such loyalty, mused, but it could blind a man to the truth. And what of Roddy Wellman? His absence from the courtroom was telling, his shallow affection for both women a thread that wove through the case. Poirot's mind turned to the torn photograph he had found in Mary's room, its edges jagged, as if ripped in haste. The man in the image was unfamiliar, but his presence suggested a secret one that might hold the key to Mary's death. As night fell, Poirot sat back, his eyes half closed, his mind racing. The courtroom had revealed much, but it had concealed more. Tomorrow, the defense would begin, and with it, a chance to challenge the prosecution's narrative. Poirot knew that the truth was close, hidden in the shadows of half-spoken words and fleeting glances. He would find it, as he always did. With the precision of his little grey cells dot in the cell, Elinor lay on the narrow cot staring at the ceiling. The walls seemed to close in, their cold stone a mirror of the doubt that gripped her heart. She thought of Aunt Laura, her gentle voice now silenced, and of the will that had promised her a future only to threaten it with secrets. She thought of Mary, her laughter echoing through Hunterbury's halls, and of the tea, its bitter taste, a question she could not answer. Had she poured it? Had she known? The memories blurred, tangled with fear and grief, until she could no longer trust her own mind. But somewhere, in the quiet of her thoughts, a spark of hope flickered. Peter's voice, steady and sure, echoed in her memory, and with it, the image of a small, fastidious man with a mustache, his eyes sharp with purpose. Hercule Poirot had promised to find the truth, and for the first time in days, Elinor allowed herself to believe that he might. As sleep finally claimed her, the courtroom's echoes faded, replaced by the faint, persistent whisper of hope. The next morning, the courtroom buzzed with renewed energy as the defense prepared to call its first witness. Mr. Seddon's strategy was clear: to dismantle the prosecution's case by exposing its reliance on circumstance rather than fact. He called Horlick, the gardener, whose weathered face and steady gaze commanded respect. Horlick testified to Elinor's kindness, her care for the estate, and her grief over Aunt Laura's death. She wasn't herself after the mistress passed, he said, his voice gruff. But murder? No, sir, Miss Elinor's not the sort. Seddon seized the opportunity to highlight the accessibility of the nurse's kit. Mr. Horlick, you were often in the house. Did you ever see the kit left unattended? Horlick nodded. It was in the hall, sometimes the drawing room. Anyone could have got to it, nurse's staff, even visitors. The testimony was a small victory, casting doubt on the prosecution's claim that Elinor alone had access to the morphine. But Sir Edwin was quick to counter, painting Horlick as a loyal servant whose testimony was biased by affection for the Carlisle family. The jury listened intently, their faces unreadable. As the battle of words continued, Poirot, meanwhile, was preoccupied with a new line of inquiry. During a recess he slipped into the corridor where he overheard a hushed conversation between two court clerks. They spoke of a local rumor. Nurse Hopkins had been seen in a nearby town, purchasing a bottle of tonic water just days before Mary's death. Tonic water, Poirot knew, could mask the taste of morphine, a detail that had not yet surfaced in the trial. He made a mental note to investigate further, his instincts tingling with the promise of a breakthrough. Back in the courtroom, the defense called a chemist of its own who challenged the prosecution's forensic evidence. The fingerprints on the vial were partial, he said, and could belong to anyone who handled it: nurses, doctors, even the police during their investigation. The testimony was technical, dense with scientific jargon, but its implication was clear. The evidence against Elinor was not as airtight as the prosecution claimed. As the day wore on, Elinor's resolve strengthened. She listened to the witnesses, her heart buoyed by Seddon's steady defense and Peter's unwavering support. But the weight of the prosecution's case still loomed, its narrative of jealousy and greed a powerful force in the jury's minds. She glanced at Poirot, his calm presence a quiet reassurance, and wondered what he saw that others missed. In the gallery, Peter watched with bated breath, his faith in Elinor unshaken. He had seen her at her best, kind, capable, devoted to her, and Tanned at her worst, consumed by doubt and heartbreak. But he could not believe her capable of murder. His thoughts drifted to Poirot, whose cryptic words about Nurse Hopkins echoed. In his mind, what had the detective seen? What did he know? As the court adjourned for the day, Poirot lingered, his eyes scanning the emptying room. He noticed Nurse Hopkins in the corridor, her face pale as she spoke to a man in a dark suit. Their conversation was brief, but the urgency in her posture was unmistakable. Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. The puzzle was taking shape, its pieces falling into place with each passing moment. Tomorrow, he would press harder, seeking the truth that lay buried beneath layers of deceit, for Elinor. The night was long, filled with restless dreams of Cypress tree, its branches swaying in a mournful wind. She saw Mary's face, her eyes bright with life, and Roddy's, his charm now a bitter memory. She saw the tea, the vial, the courtroom, all swirling together in a haze of doubt. But through it all, Poirot's voice cut through, calm and certain, promising answers where none seemed possible. And so the trial continued, a dance of truth and lies, with Elinor's fate hanging in the balance. The courtroom was a stage, its players bound by motives and secrets, and Hercule Poirot, with his relentless pursuit of truth, was determined to bring the curtain down on the real killer. Chapter 7. The New Zealand Connection. The courtroom in Maidensford was a crucible of tension, its oak-paneled walls echoing with the murmurs of spectators crammed into every available seat. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that settles over a crowd when a trial teeters on the edge of revelation. Elinor Carlisle sat in the dock, her pale hands folded tightly in her lap, her face a mask of composure that belied the storm raging within. The prosecution had painted her as a woman, consumed by jealousy, a scorned lover who had poisoned Mary Gerrard to secure her inheritance and Roddy's wavering affection. Each word from the prosecutor's mouth had been a hammer blow, chipping away at her dignity, yet she held her head high, her eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the courtroom's confines. Hercule Poirot sat in the gallery, his small, precise figure almost lost among the sea of onlookers. His sharp eyes, however, missed nothing. The way the prosecutor's voice rose with theatrical flourish, the nervous fidgeting of Nurse O'Brien on the witness stand, the subtle glances exchanged between the judge and the clerk, all were pieces of a puzzle he was determined to solve. Peter Lord, seated beside him, leaned forward, his knuckles white as he gripped the railing. His devotion to Elinor was palpable, a quiet force that seemed to anchor her even from across the room. Poirot noted this, his mind cataloguing the young doctor's loyalty as both a strength and a potential blind spot. The morning's proceedings had begun with a recap of the damning evidence: Elinor's preparation of the tea that killed Mary, her access to the morphine vial, and her undeniable motive jealousy over Roddy's infatuation. Mrs. Bishop, the stern housekeeper of Hunterbury, had testified the day before, her voice dripping with disdain as she described Elinor's cold demeanor in the days following Aunt Laura's death. She was never the same after Miss Mary caught Mr. Roddy's eye, Mrs. Bishop had said, her words landing like stones in the courtroom's silence. The prosecution had leaned heavily on this, weaving a narrative of a woman unhinged by betrayal. Poirot's mind was elsewhere. The timeline of the tea's preparation, as presented, was riddled with inconsistencies. The prosecution claimed Elinor had been alone in the kitchen when she prepared the fatal brew. Yet Nurse Hopkins had admitted to being in and out of the room, fetching supplies. The morphine vial, supposedly locked in the nurse's kit, had been left unattended for several minutes, a fact glossed over in the rush to condemn Elinor. Poirot's fingers tapped lightly on his knee, a rhythm that matched the ticking of his thoughts. The truth, he knew, lay in the details, and he was determined to unearth them. The judge's gavel cracked, calling the court to order as the next witness was announced. A ripple of surprise passed through the room as the clerk read out, Mrs. Amelia Seddon, lately arrived from New Zealand. Heads turned, whispers erupting like a sudden breeze. New Zealand? The distance was staggering, a journey of weeks by sea. Yet here was a witness whose presence suggested something monumental. Poirot's eyes narrowed, his mustache twitching slightly as he leaned forward. Peter Lord shot him a glance, his brow furrowed. "Who is she?" he whispered. Poirot's only response was a slight shake of his head, his attention fixed on the woman now taking the stand. Mrs. Seddon was a stout woman in her late 50s, her face weathered by years under a harsher sun than England's. Her grey hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her dark dress was practical, unadorned save for a small brooch at her collar. She carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had seen much and spoken little. The prosecutor, Mr. Hemming, approached her with a deference that suggested he knew the weight of her testimony. "Mrs. Seddon," Hemming began, his voice smooth but edged with anticipation, "you have traveled a great distance to be here. Could you state your connection to this case?" Mrs. Seddon's voice was steady, her accent carrying the faint lilt of her adopted homeland. "I was a friend of Laura Wellman's many years ago, when she lived in London. We corresponded until her death, though our letters grew less frequent after I moved to New Zealand in 1905. The courtroom stirred. Laura Wellman, the late mistress of Hunterbury, was the linchpin of this tragedy. Her wealth, her will, and her secrets had set this chain of events in motion. Poirot's fingers stilled, his gaze locked on Mrs. Seddon. He sensed a thread being pulled, one that might unravel the entire case. "And what brings you here today?" Hemming pressed, his tone coaxing. Mrs. Seddon's eyes flicked briefly to Elinor, then back to the prosecutor. "I received a letter from Laura, written shortly before her death. She asked me to come forward if anything happened to her or to Mary Gerrard. She entrusted me with a truth she could not share in life." The courtroom was silent now, every ear straining to catch her next words. Elinor's composure faltered, her hands tightening in her lap. Peter Lord leaned forward, his breath catching. Even Roddy, seated among the spectators, looked up, his usual detachment replaced by a flicker of unease. "And what was that truth?" Hemming asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Seddon took a deep breath, her hand smoothing her skirt as if to steady herself. Mary Gerrard was Laura Wellman's daughter, her illegitimate daughter, born of an affair with Sir Lewis Rycroft in 1902. The courtroom erupted. Spectators gasped, reporters scribbled furiously, and the judge banged his gavel, calling for order. Elinor's face drained of color, her eyes wide with shock. Poirot, however, remained still, his mind racing. This was no mere scandal, it was a motive, one that shifted the entire landscape of the case. If Mary was Laura's daughter, her bequest in the will was no act of charity, but a mother's desperate attempt to provide for her child. And if Elinor had known or even suspected, might she have seen Mary not just as a rival for Roddy's love, but as a threat to her inheritance? Hemming pressed on, his questions sharp and precise. "Did Mrs. Wellman confide in you about her intentions for Mary?" "Yes," Mrs. Seddon replied. "In her letters, Laura spoke of her guilt. She had kept Mary's parentage a secret, even from Mary herself. She wanted to provide for her, to give her a chance at a better life. She mentioned a bequest, a sum to help Mary study abroad." but she feared others might resent it, particularly her niece, Elinor. The prosecution's strategy was clear: to paint Elinor as a woman driven not only by jealousy but by greed. If Mary stood to inherit a significant portion of Laura's fortune, Elinor's motive for murder grew stronger. Hemming produced a letter, its edges worn but its handwriting unmistakably Laura's. "This is the letter you received, is it not?" he asked, holding it up for the court to see. Mrs. Seddon nodded. "Yes, it arrived in Auckland 2 months before Laura's death. She wrote of her failing health and her fear that someone close to her might act against Mary." The implication hung heavy in the air. Elinor's defense counsel, Mr. Grayson, rose to object, arguing that the letter was hearsay, but the judge overruled him, allowing it into evidence. The letter was read aloud, Laura's words filling the courtroom like a ghost's lament. I that have wronged Mary," she had written, "and I feared for her safety. If anything happens to me, Amelia, please ensure the truth comes to light." Poirot's mind was a whirlwind of connections. The letter suggested Laura had suspected danger, but from whom? Elinor was the obvious target, but Poirot's instincts told him the truth was more complex. He glanced at Nurse Hopkins, who sat in the gallery, her face impassive but her hands twisting a handkerchief. Her earlier testimony had been vague, her timeline of the tea's preparation suspiciously muddled. Poirot made a mental note to revisit her account. The cross-examination was brief but revealing. Grayson, a wiry man with a sharp tongue, pressed Mrs. Seddon on the timing of her journey. "You claim to have traveled from New Zealand on the strength of a letter received months ago. Why wait until now?" Mrs. Seddon's composure held. "I didn't know of Mary's death until a solicitor contacted me, weeks after the fact. The quickness of air travel allowed me to arrive in time for the trial." Poirot's eyebrows rose. Air travel a rarity in 1940, yet not impossible for someone of means. The solicitor's involvement suggested someone had orchestrated Mrs. Seddon's appearance, perhaps to tip the scales against Elinor, but who and why? As Mrs. Seddon stepped down, the courtroom buzzed with speculation. The prosecution called its next witness, a clerk from Laura's solicitor's office, who confirmed that Laura had inquired about amending her will to include a larger bequest for Mary. The clerk's testimony was dry, procedural, but it added another layer to the case. Elinor, struggling financially after her aunt's death, might have seen Mary's potential inheritance as a direct threat. The morning session adjourned, and the crowd spilled out into the courthouse steps, their voices a cacophony of theories and accusations. Poirot lingered in the gallery, his eyes on Elinor as she was led back to her cell. Her shoulders were slumped, her earlier defiance eroded by the weight of the new revelation. Peter Lord approached Poirot, his face etched with worry. It changes everything," he said, his voice low. "If Mary was Laura's daughter, Elinor's motive looks even stronger." Poirot tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps, mon ami, or perhaps it points us to another. The truth lies in the details, and I suspect we have not yet seen them all." That afternoon, Poirot made his way to the local inn where Nurse Hopkins was staying. The inn was a quaint, ivy-covered building, its low ceilings and dark beams a stark contrast to the airy grandeur of Hunterbury. Nurse Hopkins was in the parlor, sipping tea with an air of forced calm. When Poirot entered, her eyes flicked up, and for a moment, he caught a flash of unease. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, setting her cup down, "I didn't expect to see you here." Poirot smiled, his manner disarming. "A small visit, Nurse Hopkins, to clarify a detail or two. The mind it becomes cluttered with so many accounts nest CPA." She nodded, but her fingers tightened. Around her saucer, Poirot sat across from her, his hands folded neatly. "You were in the kitchen when Miss Carlisle prepared the tea, were you not?" "Yes," she replied, her voice steady but guarded. "I was fetching bandages from the pantry. I wasn't there the whole time. And the morphine was it kept in my kit, locked, as always?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Yet it was left unattended, you said, for several minutes, long enough for someone to take it." Her face flushed. "I suppose so, but I didn't see anyone near it. Elinor was the only one in the kitchen when I returned." Poirot nodded as if satisfied, but his next question was sharp. "Tell me, Nurse Hopkins, have you ever misplaced a syringe? One from your kit? Perhaps?" Her eyes widened, and for a moment, she seemed to falter. "A syringe? No, I keep careful track of my equipment." Poirot leaned forward, his voice soft but relentless. "Yet I have heard of a syringe missing from Hunterbury, one reported by Nurse O'Brien. A small thing, perhaps, but significant in a case of poisoning, Nan." Nurse Hopkins's composure cracked, her hands trembling as she reached for her tea. "I don't know what you're implying, Mr. Poirot. I had nothing to do with Mary's death." Poirot rose, his smile, polite but cold. "Of course, Nurse Hopkins, I merely seek the truth. And the truth, it has a way of revealing itself." As he left the inn, Poirot's mind was alight with possibilities. The missing syringe, Nurse Hopkins' evasive answers, the New Zealand connection, all were threads in a tapestry he was only beginning to understand. He returned to Hunterbury that evening, the estate's cypress trees casting long shadows in the fading light. In Mary's room, he sifted through her belongings, his fingers brushing against the torn photograph he had found earlier. The man, in the image was still a mystery. But Poirot suspected he held the key to Mary's death. The chapter closed with Poirot standing at Hunterbury's gates, the wind carrying the faint scent of Cypress. Nurse Hopkins's flustered response had betrayed her, and the missing syringe was no mere oversight. The truth was close, but it would require one final push, a confrontation that would expose the killer and save Elinor from the gallows. Chapter 8. The web of lies. Hercule Poirot sat in the dimly lit parlor of Hunterbury, his small, precise hands folded neatly in his lap. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and wax polish, but beneath it lingered a tension that seemed to seep from the very walls. The estate, once a beacon of grandeur, now felt like a stage where every player hid a secret. Poirot's grey eyes, sharp as a hawk's, scanned the room, taking in every detail: the faded velvet curtains, the ticking of the grandfather clock, the faint smudge of dust on the mantelpiece. He had spent the morning piecing together the threads of this intricate case, and now, as evening settled over Maidensford, he was ready to pull at the strands that would unravel the truth. The courtroom drama had reached a fever pitch. Elinor Carlisle, pale and composed, stood accused of Mary Gerrard's murder, her every word and gesture dissected by a jury hungry for a villain. The prosecution had painted her as a woman consumed by jealousy, her heart twisted by wandering affections. Yet Poirot, observing from the gallery, saw more than a scorned lover. He saw a woman trapped in a web of circumstance, her fate hanging on the smallest details he was determined to uncover. The day had begun with Poirot's visit to the local chemist, Mr. Seddon, a wiry man with a nervous tic who kept meticulous records. Poirot's questions were gentle but relentless, probing the purchase of morphine in Maidensford over the past year. Seddon's ledger revealed a curious entry: a small quantity of morphine sulfate, signed for by Nurse Hopkins, for a private patient months before Aunt Laura's death. The signature was neat, almost too perfect, and Poirot's mustache twitched as he noted the date long before Mary's poisoning. "Most interesting," he murmured, his mind already turning over the implications. Back at Hunterbury, had arranged to meet Nurse Hopkins, whose evasive answers in earlier interviews had piqued his suspicion. She arrived promptly at 6, her starched uniform crisp but her eyes wary. "Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice clipped, "I hope this won't take long. I've duties to attend to." "Bean, sir, Nurse Hopkins," Poirot replied, his tone smooth as silk. "But the truth, it has a way of demanding our time, does it not?" He gestured to a chair, and she sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Poirot's questions began innocently about her training, her years in Maidensford, her care for Aunt Laura. But with each answer, he steered the conversation toward the fatal day of Mary's death. "You prepared the tea tray, did you not? The one from which Mademoiselle Gerrard drank?" Hopkins's lips tightened. "I helped, yes, but Elinor was there, fussing over the sandwiches. She insisted on doing it herself." "Insisted?" Poirot's eyebrows rose. "Curatio, and the morphine, how might it have found its way into the tea?" "I wouldn't know," she snapped, her cheeks flushing. "I'm no chemist. I only know what I sell," and hovering over that tray like a hawk. Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. He had already spoken to Mrs. Bishop, the housekeeper, whose account differed subtly. She recalled Nurse Hopkins alone in the kitchen for several minutes before Elinor arrived, handling the teapot with unusual care. A small detail Poirot had said to Peter Lord earlier, but the truth, it hides in such places. As Nurse Hopkins spoke, Poirot's mind drifted to another clue: the torn photograph he had found in Mary's room. It showed her standing beside a man in a naval uniform, his face partially obscured. The back bore a faint inscription, L.R. 1918, which Poirot suspected referred to Sir Lewis Rycroft, Mary's father. The photograph suggested a connection Mary herself might not have fully understood, a connection someone else might have feared. Had Mary stumbled onto a secret worth killing for? Poirot's thoughts were interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Horlick, the gardener, his weathered face etched with unease. "Begging your pardon, sir," he said, glancing at Nurse Hopkins, "I found something in the shed you might want to see." Poirot excused himself, following Horlick to a small outbuilding behind the estate. There, tucked beneath a pile of gardening tools, was a crumpled apron, stained with a faint brownish residue. Poirot's gloved fingers lifted it carefully, his nose detecting the bitter scent of morphine. "Mon Dieu," he whispered. Another thread in the web. Returning to the parlor, Poirot resumed his questioning, now armed with new suspicion. "Nurse Hopkins," he said, his voice deceptively mild, "you have worked in other places before Maidensford, perhaps a hospital in London?" Her eyes flickered. "Yes, St. Mary's. Why do you ask?" "And there was a case, was there? Not a patient who died unexpectedly, a question of missing morphine, perhaps?" Hopkins stiffened, her hands clenching. "That was years ago. A misunderstanding, nothing more." "Perhaps," Poirot said, leaning forward. "But misunderstandings, they have a way of following us, do they not, like shadows?" He watched her closely, noting the bead of sweat on her brow. His research, aided by a discreet call to a contact in London, had confirmed his suspicions. Nurse Hopkins had been dismissed from St. Mary's after a patient's death was linked to a morphine overdose. No charges were filed, but the incident had left a stain on her record, a stain she had worked hard to erase. The conversation was interrupted by Peter Lord, who burst into the room, his face flushed with urgency. "Poirot, I've just spoken to Nurse O'Brien. She remembers something odd: Hopkins washing a teacup the morning Mary died, before anyone could examine it." Hopkins's face drained of color. "That's nonsense. I was cleaning up." "That's all cleaning up evidence, perhaps." Poirot's voice was soft, but it cut like a blade. He rose, pacing the room with deliberate steps. "Let us consider. Nurse Hopkins, you had access to morphine. You were alone with the tea tray. You have a history with this poison. And now a cup is washed before it can be tested. Most convenient." "None," she stood, her voice trembling with indignation. "You're accusing me of murder? That's absurd. Elinor Carlisle is the one with motive. Everyone saw how she hated Mary." Poirot stopped pacing, his eyes locking onto hers. "Hate. Yes, but hate does not always lead to murder. Sometimes it is fear that pulls the trigger. Fear of exposure, perhaps. Fear that Mary Gerrard, with her innocent questions, had begun to suspect something about you." The room fell silent, the ticking of the clock deafening. Poirot's words hung in the air, each one a weight pressing down on Nurse Hopkins. He had no proof, not yet, but he knew the power of a well-placed suggestion. He needed her to falter, to reveal the crack in her carefully constructed facade. Over the next few hours, Poirot pieced together more of the puzzle. He visited Mary's room again, sifting through her belongings with meticulous care. Tucked inside a book of poetry was a folded note, its edges worn from frequent handling. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words were chilling. "You think you're clever, but I know what you did. Pay up or everyone will know." Blackmail. The word echoed in Poirot's mind. Had Mary been threatening someone? And if so, who? He recalled his earlier conversation with Roddy Wellman, whose shallow charm had crumbled under scrutiny. Roddy admitted to his infatuation with Mary, but swore he had no part in her death. "I loved her," he had said, his voice breaking. "I'd never hurt her." Poirot believed him not out of sentiment, but because Roddy lacked the cunning to orchestrate such a crime. His heart was fickle, not malicious. Elinor, meanwhile, sat in her cell, her thoughts a storm of regret and fear. She replayed the day of Mary's death, her hands trembling as she recalled slicing the sandwiches, pouring the tea. Had she been careless? Had someone tampered with the tray while she wasn't looking? The memory of Roddy's distant gaze, his laughter with Mary, cut deeper than any accusation. She had loved him, but now she wondered if that love had blinded her to the truth. Peter Lord's visits were her only solace, his quiet strength a lifeline in the chaos. Poirot's investigation took him back to the courtroom, where he sat through another grueling day of testimony. The prosecution called a chemist who confirmed the morphine in Mary's system matched the type used at Hunterbury, but Poirot's attention was elsewhere, on Nurse O'Brien, who fidgeted in the witness box, her eyes darting to Hopkins in the gallery. O'Brien's testimony was brief, but her hesitation when asked about the tea tray spoke volumes. Poirot made a mental note to speak with her again, alone. That evening he returned to Hunterbury, determined to test his theory. He invited Nurse Hopkins for another meeting, this time in the kitchen where Mary had died. The room was unchanged, the teapot still on the counter, a silent witness to the tragedy. Poirot had arranged for Peter Lord and Nurse O'Brien to be present, along with Inspector Marsden, a gruff but fair policeman who had grown to respect Poirot's methods. "Nurse Hopkins," Poirot began, his voice calm but commanding, "I have a small experiment to propose. Let us recreate the moment of the tea. You will prepare it, as you did that day, and we shall see what happens." Hopkins hesitated, her eyes narrowing. "This is ridiculous. I've told you everything." "Indulge me," Poirot said, his smile disarming. He handed her a teapot and a tin of tea leaves, watching her every move. As she filled the pot, her hands shook slightly, betraying her nerves. Poirot noted the way she glanced at the sugar bowl, a fleeting look that confirmed his suspicion. He had already tested the bowl earlier, finding traces of morphine residue carefully planted, he suspected, to frame Elinor. As Hopkins poured the tea, Poirot leaned forward, his voice low. "Tell me, Nurse Hopkins, did you ever speak to Mary about her father, about Sir Lewis Recroft?" Her hand froze, the teapot tilting slightly. "What does that have to do with anything?" "Everything," Poirot said. "Mary was curious, was she not? She asked questions that made you uncomfortable. Perhaps she found something in your past, something you wished to keep hidden." Hopkins slammed the teapot down, her face contorted with anger. "You're fishing, Mr. Poirot. You have no proof." "No proof." Poirot's voice was soft, but his eyes gleamed with certainty. "Then let us consider the apron in the shed, stained with morphine, the note in Mary's room, hinting at blackmail, the washed teacup, so conveniently cleaned, and your history, Nurse Hopkins, a history of morphine and death." She staggered back, her breath coming in short gasps. Peter Lord stepped forward, his voice urgent. "Poirot, what are you saying?" "I am saying," Poirot replied, turning to the room, "that Nurse Hopkins had a secret Mary Gerrard discovered, perhaps by accident, a secret worth killing for." The room erupted in chaos. Nurse O'Brien gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Inspector Marsden moved closer, his eyes fixed on Hopkins. And Hopkins herself, cornered like a trapped animal, let out a cry of rage. "You can't prove anything, it's all lies." But Poirot was relentless. He produced the crumpled apron, the note, the chemist's ledger, laying them out like pieces of a puzzle. "You stole morphine from St. Mary's," he said, his voice cutting through her protests. "You feared Mary knew, or suspected. Perhaps she saw you take the vial from Hunterbury. Perhaps she threatened to tell. And so, you poisoned her tea, knowing Elinor would be blamed." Hopkins's resolve crumbled, her shoulders sagging. "I didn't mean to," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. She was asking too many questions. "I couldn't let her ruin me." Inspector Marsden stepped forward, his voice grim. "Ethel Hopkins, you're under arrest for the murder of Mary Gerrard." As Hopkins was led away, Poirot turned to Peter, Lord, whose face was a mix of relief and horror. "You saved her," Peter said, his voice thick with emotion. "Elinor will be free." "Not yet," Poirot cautioned. "The courtroom must hear this confession, but the truth, it is now clear." Back in the courtroom the next day, Poirot took the stand, his testimony a masterclass in clarity and precision. He recounted every detail, the morphine, the apron, the note, the washed teacup, laying bare Nurse Hopkins's motive and method. The jury listened, rapt, as he described how Hopkins had manipulated the scene to frame Elinor, exploiting her jealousy as a convenient scapegoat. Elinor, sitting in the dock, felt a weight lift from her chest, her eyes meeting Peter's across the room. The prosecution scrambled to counter Poirot's testimony, but their case was unraveling. Witnesses were recalled, their stories now viewed through a new lens. Nurse O'Brien admitted to seeing Hopkins linger in the kitchen, her earlier hesitation born of fear. Mrs. Bishop confirmed the apron's discovery, her stern demeanor softening as she realized Elinor's innocence. As the day drew to a close, Poirot stepped down from the stand, his work nearly done. He glanced at Elinor, whose face, though pale, held a glimmer of hope. "The truth," he murmured to himself. "It is a stubborn thing." That night, Poirot sat alone in his room at the King's Arms, the village, and he sipped a tisane, his mind still turning over the case. There were loose ends Roddy's role. For one, his testimony had been weak, his affection for Mary shallow and fleeting. Poirot suspected Roddy's charm had blinded many, but it had not fooled him. He was a man who loved the idea of love, not the reality. Elinor, on the other hand, was a study in resilience. Her love for Roddy had been real, but it had cost her dearly. Poirot wondered if Peter Lord's quiet devotion would be the bomb she needed. He had seen the way Peter looked at her, the way his hand lingered on hers during their visits. There was a future there, if Elinor could let go of the past. The final piece of the puzzle was the cryptic note. Poirot had traced its handwriting to a former patient of Nurse Hopkins, a man who had died under suspicious circumstances at St. Mary's. The note suggested Mary had stumbled onto Hopkins's secret, perhaps through a conversation with the patient's family in New Zealand. It was a small detail, but it had cost Mary her life. As Poirot prepared for bed, he felt a quiet satisfaction. The web of lies had been untangled, each thread carefully examined. Nurse Hopkins would face justice, and Elinor would be free. But the cost of truth was always high. And Poirot knew the scars of this case would linger for Elinor, for Peter, for all who had been touched by Hunterbury's tragedy. The chapter closed with Poirot setting a final meeting at Hunterbury Trap to confirm his suspicions. He had invited Nurse Hopkins, knowing she would try to cover her tracks. The tea she offered him was laced with morphine. He had seen her slip the powder into the sugar bowl, her hands trembling. But Poirot was no fool. He poured the tea into a potted plant, his smile never wavering. "A pity," he said, as Hopkins's face fell. "The tea, it is not to my taste." The confession that followed was swift, her words tumbling out like a dam breaking. She had killed Mary to protect her secret, to keep her past buried. Poirot listened, his heart heavy with the weight of human frailty. As the police took her away, he stood in the kitchen, the teapot still on the counter, a silent reminder of the truth's cost. Elinor, still in her cell, awaited the verdict, unaware of the drama unfolding at Hunterbury. But Poirot knew the tide had turned. The truth, once revealed, could not be undone. And as he left the estate, the cypress tree in the garden swayed in the wind, its mournful branches whispering of secrets finally laid bare. Chapter 9. The trap springs. The air at Hunterbury Estate hung heavy with the scent of damp earth and fading roses, as if the grounds themselves sensed the unraveling of secrets. Hercule Poirot stood in the drawing-room, his polished shoes sinking slightly into the Persian rug, his sharp grey eyes scanning every detail: the ornate mantelpiece, the heavy velvet curtains, the faint dust on the mahogany table. It was here, in this room, that he had arranged to meet Nurse Hopkins, the woman whose evasions had begun to form a pattern in his mind, like threads in a tapestry waiting to be woven into truth. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second a heartbeat in the stillness of the afternoon, as Poirot prepared to spring his trap. Outside, the late summer sun cast long shadows across the lawn, where Horlick the gardener trimmed the hedges with a methodical snip-snip that echoed faintly through the open window. Poirot adjusted his tie, a small, precise gesture, and glanced at the tea tray he had instructed Mrs. Bishop to prepare. The tray held a silver teapot, 2 delicate porcelain cups, a sugar bowl, and a plate of sandwiches innocent enough to the untrained eye, but to Poirot it was the stage for a performance that would either confirm his suspicions or force him to rethink the entire case. Nurse Hopkins arrived promptly at 3 o'clock, her starched uniform crisp, despite the warmth of the day. Her broad face, framed by iron-gray hair pulled tightly into a bun, betrayed no emotion as she stepped into the room. "Mr. Poirot," she said, her voice clipped, "I hope this won't take long. I've duties to attend to." Poirot's mustache twitched as he offered a courteous smile. "But of course, Nurse Hopkins. A few moments only, to clarify some inconsistencies. Please sit. The tea is freshly brewed." She hesitated, her eyes flicking to the tray, then sat stiffly on the edge of a high-backed chair. Poirot poured the tea with deliberate care, the amber liquid steaming as it filled the cups. He pushed one toward her, along with the sugar bowl, 2 lumps. "I believe you prefer?" he asked, his tone light but his gaze piercing. "Yes," she replied, her fingers steady as she added the sugar and stirred. "Now, what's this about, Mr. Poirot? I've told you everything I know about poor Mary's death." Poirot sipped his tea, his movements slow, almost theatrical. "Everything, you say? Yet I find myself puzzled, Nurse Hopkins. A syringe, missing from your kit, a vial of morphine, unaccounted for, and your presence in Maidensford so conveniently timed with another poisoning case some years ago. These are not mere coincidences." Her spoon clinked against the cup, a faint tremor betraying her composure. "I don't know what you're implying," she said, her voice rising slightly. "I'm a nurse, not a criminal. That syringe could have been misplaced, and the morphine, well, these things that happen in a busy household." Poirot leaned forward, his hands clasped. "Misplaced, you say? Yet you are a woman of precision, Nurse Hopkins. Your kit is always orderly, your records meticulous. And yet, this syringe vanishes at the precise moment Mary Gerrard dies of morphine. Poisoning curious." Her lips pressed into a thin line, and she set the cup down with a deliberate clink. "I won't be accused without evidence. Mr. Poirot, if you've something to say it plain." "Very well," Poirot said, his voice soft but unyielding. "I say that you, Nurse Hopkins, had motive and opportunity. Mary Gerrard, she was, how shall we say, too curious. She had begun to ask questions, had she not? About your past, about certain discrepancies in your work. Perhaps she overheard something in conversation, a confession that threatened to expose you." Nurse Hopkins's face flushed, her hands gripping the arms of the chair. "That's nonsense. Mary was a sweet girl, but she wasn't nosy. She had her own troubles, what with Roddy Wellman mooning over her and Elinor Carlisle glaring daggers." Poirot nodded, as if conceding the point. "Indeed, the triangle of love and jealousy is compelling. But let us consider another possibility. You were in Maidensford years ago, were you not? A patient died under your care, poisoned by morphine. The case was dismissed as an accident, but I have spoken with a certain Dr. Fielding, now retired, who remembers you well. He remarked on your familiarity with the drug." Her eyes widened, a flicker of fear breaking through her defiance. "That was investigated and cleared. You can't drag up old gossip to pin this on me." Poirot raised a hand, silencing her. "Gossip, no facts." "Yes, and the fact is, Nurse Hopkins, you were afraid Mary Gerrard had learned of your past. Perhaps she found a letter, a record, or perhaps she simply saw too much. You could not risk her speaking, could you? So you acted. The tea, the sandwiches, the morphine, it was all so simple for one with your skill." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "This is outrageous. I won't sit here and be slandered." She reached for her bag, but Poirot was faster, his hand darting out to grasp the sugar bowl. "One moment, Nurse Hopkins," he said, his voice now cold as steel. "Before you leave, allow me to demonstrate a little experiment." He lifted the sugar bowl and poured its contents into a small glass vial he produced from his pocket. The liquid shimmered faintly, a trace of tea mingling with the sugar. "You did not drink your tea, I notice. A wise choice, perhaps, for I suspect if we were to test this, we would find more than sugar within." Her face drained of color, her breath catching. "What are you talking about?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "I poured my own tea into this bowl, Nurse Hopkins, when you were not looking a precaution. You understand. And I believe, if analyzed, it would reveal morphine enough to kill, just as it killed Mary Gerrard. You thought to poison me, did you not? To silence the questions, as you silenced her." She staggered back, her hand clutching the table for support. No, you're wrong. I didn't, but you did." Poirot interrupted, his voice relentless. "You prepared the tea for Mary, just as you prepared it for me today. You knew Elinor Carlisle would be blamed, her jealousy a perfect mask for your crime. But you underestimated Hercule Poirot, and you underestimated the truth, which always finds its way to the light." Nurse Hopkins's knees buckled, and she sank back into the chair, her hands trembling. I didn't mean for it to go this far," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Mary was asking questions, yes, She found a letter in my bag, an old record from that other case. She didn't know what it meant, but she was clever, too clever. I couldn't let her ruin me. I'd worked too hard to lose everything. Poirot's expression softened, but only slightly. And so, you chose murder, not for greed, not for inheritance, but for self-preservation. You stole the morphine, you poisoned the tea, and you let Elinor Carlisle take the blame. But tell me, Nurse Hopkins, was it worth it? The weight of such a secret, does it not crush the soul? Tears welled in her eyes, and she buried her face in her hands. I didn't want to kill her, she sobbed. I panicked. I thought if I could make it look like an accident, no one would know. But then you came, with your questions, and your eyes that see everything. Poirot stepped back, his face a mask of resolve. The truth. It is a relentless hunter, Nurse Hopkins, and now it has found you. He turned to the door, where Inspector Marsden, summoned earlier, stood waiting with 2 constables. You will accompany these gentlemen. I think they will. We have questions of their own. As the constables led Nurse Hopkins away, her sobs echoing down the hall, Poirot remained in the drawing room, his gaze fixed on the tea tray. The weight of the case pressed upon him, not the triumph of solving it, but the tragedy of lives undone by envy, fear, and desperation. He thought of Elinor Carlisle, still languishing in a cell, unaware that her salvation was at hand. He thought of Mary Gerrard, whose curiosity had cost her life, and of Aunt Laura, whose love for her secret daughter had set this chain of events in motion. The clock chimed 4, and Poirot straightened, his mind already turning to the courtroom. There Elinor's fate hung in the balance, the jury deliberating as the hours ticked by. He knew his testimony would be crucial, his reconstruction of the truth a lifeline for a woman who had loved too deeply and suffered too greatly. But for now, he allowed himself a moment of quiet, standing beneath the cypress tree outside Hunterbury, its branches swaying mournfully in the breeze. The trap had sprung, the killer was caught, but the scars of this case would linger. Poirot knew this, as he knew the human hearts capable of great love, great cruelty, and great regret. He turned back to the house, his steps firm, ready to face the final act of this drama, where justice would be served, but healing would take far longer. The courtroom in Maidensford was a study in contrasts, the polished oak benches gleaming under the morning light, the air thick with tension as spectators whispered in the gallery. Elinor Carlisle sat in the dock, her pale face composed but her eyes hollow, as if the weight of the trial had drained her of all but the will to endure. The jury had returned, their faces unreadable, and the judge, a stern figure in scarlet robes, called for order. Poirot sat in the witness box, his small frame commanding the room's attention. He had been called to testify, his reputation as a detective lending weight to his words. The prosecution had painted a damning picture of Elinor jealous, desperate, with motive and opportunity to poison Mary Gerrard. But Poirot's testimony was a scalpel, cutting through their narrative with precision. Members of the jury, he began, his voice clear and measured. You have heard much of Miss Carlisle's supposed motives, her love for Roderick Wellman, her fear of losing her inheritance. But I submit to you that the truth lies not in passion, but in calculation. The true culprit is one whose motive was not love, but fear of exposure, fear of ruin. He recounted the events at Hunterbury, his discovery of the missing syringe, the poisoned tea, and Nurse Hopkins' confession. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as he described the trap he had set, the sugar bowl that held the evidence of her guilt. The prosecution objected, claiming hearsay, but the judge allowed Poirot to continue, his authority unassailable. Nurse Hopkins, Poirot said, knew that Mary Gerrard had stumbled upon a secret from her past, a record of a previous poisoning case, dismissed but never forgotten. She acted to protect herself, using her knowledge of morphine to eliminate the threat. Miss Carlisle, she was merely a convenient scapegoat, her emotions manipulated to cast suspicion upon her. Elinor's eyes met Poirot's, a flicker of hope breaking through her despair. Peter Lord, seated in the gallery, leaned forward, his hands clenched, as if willing the jury to see the truth. The defense counsel, a wiry man named Mr. Seddon, seized the moment, calling for a re-examination of the evidence and the immediate release of his client. The jury deliberated for only an hour, lifetime for Elinor, a mere moment for Poirot, who waited outside the courtroom, his hat in hand. When the foreman announced the verdict not guilty, the room erupted in cheers and sobs. Elinor swayed, her hands gripping the rail, as Peter Lord rushed to her side, his arm steadying her. Poirot watched from a distance, his work complete but his heart heavy. He knew the scars of this ordeal would linger for Elinor, for Peter, for all who had been touched by the tragedy at Hunterbury. As he stepped into the sunlight, the cypress tree's shadow fell across his path, a reminder of the sorrow that had brought him here. In the days that followed, Hunterbury seemed to breathe again, its halls no longer haunted by suspicion. Elinor, free but fragile, walked the grounds with Peter Lord, his quiet presence a balm to her wounded spirit. Poirot joined them one afternoon, his manner gentle but his words direct. Miss Carlisle, he said, you have endured much, but you are not alone. The heart, it heals, though it takes time. And you, Dr. Lord, you will be there, I think, to help her find her way. Peter blushed, his eyes meeting Elinor's. "I'll try, Mr. Poirot. I owe you more than I can say." Poirot waved a hand. "You owe me nothing, mon ami. The truth, it is its own reward and its own burden." As they stood beneath the cypress tree, its branches swaying in the wind, Elinor spoke, her voice soft but steady. "I thought I'd lost everything, Roddy, Aunt Laura, myself. But now I see there's a future, isn't there?" Poirot smiled, his eyes warm. "There is always a future, mademoiselle. Even when the cypress falls, new life grows in its shadow." And with that, he tipped his hat and walked away, leaving them to their beginning. His work in Maidensford done. Chapter 10. The Cypress Falls. The courtroom in Maidensford was a cauldron of anticipation, its oak-paneled walls echoing with the murmurs of spectators as the jury filed back into their seats. Elinor Carlisle sat in the dock, her pale hands clasped tightly in her lap, her dark eyes fixed on a point beyond the judge's bench. The weight of the trial weeks of accusations, damning testimonies, and the relentless scrutiny of her every gesture had carved hollows beneath her cheekbones. Yet, in this moment, as the foreman rose to deliver the verdict, a flicker of hope stirred within her, kindled by Hercule Poirot's relentless pursuit of the truth. The judge, his wig slightly askew, adjusted his spectacles and addressed the foreman with a voice that carried the gravity of finality. "Have you reached a verdict?" "We have, my lord," the foreman replied, his tone steady but tinged with unease. The courtroom held its breath, the air thick with the scent of polished wood and nervous sweat. Elinor's fingers tightened, her nails digging into her palms. As the foreman spoke the words that would determine her fate, "We find the defendant, Elinor Carlisle, not guilty." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery, followed by a burst of chatter that the judge's gavel swiftly silenced. Elinor's knees buckled, and she gripped the edge of the dock to steady herself. "Not guilty." The words reverberated in her mind, unreal, as if spoken in a dream. Her gaze darted to the gallery, where Peter Lord sat, his kind face breaking into a relieved smile. Beside him, Hercule Poirot, immaculate in his pinstripe suit, gave a subtle nod, his mustache twitching with quiet satisfaction. The ordeal was over, or so it seemed, as the judge dismissed the court. The crowd surged forward, reporters shouting questions, their pencils poised like daggers. Elinor shrank back, overwhelmed by the sudden clamor. Peter Lord was at her side in an instant, his hand gently guiding her through the throng. "Come, Elinor," he murmured, his voice a steady anchor. "Let's get you out of here." It slipped through a side door, evading the press, and emerged into a narrow alley behind the courthouse. The summer air was warm, carrying the faint scent of blooming jasmine from a nearby garden. Elinor leaned against the cool stone wall, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "It's over," she whispered, more to herself than to Peter. "It's really over." Peter's eyes, warm and unwavering, met hers. "You're free, Elinor, free to start again." His words were simple, but they carried a depth of feeling that made her heart ache. She wanted to thank him, to express the gratitude that swelled within her, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she offered a tremulous smile, and he returned it, his hand lingering on her arm. Their moment of quiet was interrupted by the soft click of polished shoes on cobblestone. Hercule Poirot approached, his small frame exuding an air of calm authority. "Mademoiselle Carlisle," he said, his accent crisp. "I trust you are relieved, Nan." Elinor nodded, her voice still unsteady. "I owe you everything, Monsieur Poirot. Without you—" She trailed off, unable to articulate the abyss she had faced. Poirot waved a hand dismissively, his green eyes gleaming with intelligence. "It is the truth that saves, mademoiselle, not Hercule Poirot. But come, let us leave this place. There is much to discuss, and Hunterbury awaits." The trio made their way to a waiting car, its engine humming softly. As they drove through Maidensford's winding streets, Elinor gazed out at the familiar sights: the village green, the ancient church spire, the ivy-clad cottages, yet they felt distant, as if belonging to another life. Her thoughts drifted to Hunterbury, the state that had been both her refuge and her prison. The cypress tree in its garden, with its mournful branches, loomed in her memory, a symbol of the sorrow that had enveloped her. The drive to Hunterbury was silent, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional rustle of Poirot's notebook, as he jotted down thoughts. Peter stole glances at Elinor, his concern evident, but he respected her need for quiet. When they reached the estate, the iron gates creaked open, revealing the sprawling lawns and the elegant Georgian house, its windows glinting in the late afternoon sun. Elinor stepped out of the car, her feet crunching on the gravel drive. The air was heavy with the scent of roses and freshly cut grass, a stark contrast to the sterile courtroom. She paused, her eyes drawn to the cypress tree at the far end of the garden, its silhouette stark against the golden sky. "It's still here," she murmured, her voice barely audible. Poirot followed her gaze, his expression thoughtful. "The cypress, it is a tree of mourning, but also of endurance. It stands through storms, mademoiselle, as you have." They entered the house, its halls quieter now without Aunt Laura's presence or the bustle of staff. "Mrs. Bishop," The housekeeper had left for a new position, and Horlick, the gardener, was tending the grounds elsewhere. The emptiness suited Elinor. It gave her space to breathe, to reclaim the home that had been tainted by suspicion. In the drawing room, Poirot settled into an armchair, his hands folded neatly over his notebook. Peter stood by the window, his silhouette framed by the fading light, while Elinor sank onto the sofa, her hand smoothing the fabric of her skirt. "Monsieur Poirot," she began, her voice stronger now. "Please, tell me everything. How did you know it was Nurse Hopkins?" Poirot's eyes twinkled, relishing the opportunity to unravel the mystery from the beginning. "Mademoiselle," Hercule Poirot observed the little details, the inconsistencies that others overlook. "Nurse Hopkins. She was too quick to point the finger at you, too eager to describe your supposed jealousy. But jealousy, it is a loud emotion, not Mademoiselle was silent in your pain, restrained." This did not fit the picture of a murderer driven by passion. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "Then, there. What's the matter of the morphine?" The vial in the nurse's kit was full when it should have been diminished, suggesting it had been replaced to cover a theft. Nurse Hopkins, she had a history case in Leeds, years ago, where morphine went missing. Under her care, she was never charged, but the coincidence, it was too great. Eleanor's breath caught. "You mean she killed Mary to keep her quiet?" Precisement, Poirot said, tapping his temple. "Mary Gerrard." She was observant, curious. She had begun to ask questions about the morphine, perhaps suspecting Nurse Hopkins's past. Hopkins feared exposure, for her career and her freedom depended on her secret remaining buried. "So, she poisoned Mary, using the tea as her weapon, and framed you, mademoiselle, knowing your engagement to Monsieur Wellman gave a convenient motive." Peter frowned, stepping closer. "But the syringe, Poirot. You mentioned a missing syringe in court. How did you know?" Poirot's mustache curved upward. "A deduction, Dr. Lord. The morphine was administered through the tea, but the syringe was the source. Nurse Hopkins claimed it was lost, yet I found traces of adhesive on her medical bag, suggesting she had hidden it, perhaps to dispose of later. When I confronted her at Hunterbury, I gave her the chance to repeat her crime-offering tea, which she laced with poison, thinking to silence me. But Hercule Poirot is not so easily dispatched." He chuckled softly, a sound that belied the danger he had faced. Elinor shuddered, her mind replaying the moment of Mary's death, the cup of tea, the sudden collapse. "She was so young," she whispered. "She didn't deserve this." "No, one deserves such a fate," Poirot said gently. "But greed and fear, they twist the heart. Nurse Hopkins saw Mary not as a person, but as a threat to her survival. And you, mademoiselle, were the perfect scapegoat." Peter's jaw tightened. "And Roddy, where does he fit in all this?" Poirot's expression darkened, a rare flicker of disdain crossing his features. "Monsieur Wellman, he is a man of charm but little substance. His affection for Mary was fleeting, a fancy born of boredom. His betrayal of you, mademoiselle, was not malice but weakness. He is not the villain, but neither is he the hero." Elinor's lips pressed into a thin line. Roddy, the name once sparked warmth in her chest, but now it felt like a bruise, tender and fading. "He's gone," she said softly. "I don't think I'll ever see him the same way again." Peter reached for her hand, his touch tentative but warm. "You don't need him, Elinor. You're stronger than he ever was." She met his gaze, her heart stirring at the sincerity in his eyes. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of possibility, a future untainted by betrayal or guilt. "Thank you, Peter," she said, her voice steady, "for believing in me." Poirot cleared his throat, a subtle reminder of his presence. "And now, mademoiselle, what will you do with your freedom?" "Hunterbury. It is yours, but it carries memories." "Nan." Elinor glanced around the room, its familiar furnishings both comforting and oppressive. "I don't know," she admitted. "Part of me wants to sell it, to leave it all behind, but another part, it feels like running away." "There is no shame in starting anew," Poirot said. "The past, it shapes us, but it does not define us. You have endured, mademoiselle, and that is no small thing." They spoke for hours, the conversation weaving through the details of the case, the revelations about Mary's parentage, and the quiet heroism of Peter's unwavering support. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Elinor felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The truth, as Poirot had said, had saved her not just from the gallows, but from the prison of her own doubts. At last Poirot rose, adjusting his hat with a flourish. "I must return to London, mes amis. There are other mysteries awaiting Hercule Poirot, but I leave you in good hands." He inclined his head toward Peter, a knowing smile playing on his lips. Peter blushed, but his eyes never left Elinor. "I'll take care of her, Poirot, I promise." Elinor walked Poirot to the door, her steps lighter than they had been in months. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, pausing at the threshold, "how can I ever repay you?" Poirot's eyes softened. "Live well, mademoiselle, that is payment enough." With a final bow, he stepped into the twilight, his figure disappearing down the drive. Elinor turned back to the house, where Peter waited, his silhouette framed by the warm glow of the drawing room. She crossed the lawn, her gaze drawn once more to the cypress tree. Its branches swayed gently in the evening breeze, no longer a symbol of mourning but of resilience. She stood beneath it, the cool grass brushing her ankles, and felt the stirrings of a new beginning. "Elinor," Peter called softly, joining her under the tree. "What are you thinking?" She smiled, a true smile, unburdened by fear. I'm ready to start again." He took her hand, his fingers intertwining with hers. "Then let's do it together." As the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, Elinor felt the weight of the past slip away. Hunterbury, with its secrets and sorrows, would always be a part of her, but it no longer held her captive. The cypress tree stood sentinel, its branches whispering of endurance. As Elinor stepped into a future she could finally call her own, the night closed around them, soft and forgiving, and for the first time in a long time, Elinor Carlisle felt truly free.